Tetsuya Nomura's track record with Final Fantasy has been very significant ever since he was the character designer for Final Fantasy VII. Even though he started out as a debug programmer for Final Fantasy IV on the Super Famicom, to the designer of the monsters in Final Fantasy V and VI, his breakout in fame was thanks to Square's first outing of the series on the PlayStation. While working on other projects like the Parasite Eve franchise, Brave Fencer Musashi, The Bouncer, and eventually becoming the full-time director of the Kingdom Hearts IP, Nomura would always lead the pack when working on his trademark character designs and base story planning for Final Fantasy VII and VIII. His role would be greatly influenced in other projects outside and inside the Final Fantasy series when more of his role as creative producer started to take full effect, even to this very day. His role as a director for a Final Fantasy title was not that very common, since he was the full-time director for Kingdom Hearts, but the only Final Fantasy title he was a full-time director on would be the CGI film Final Fantasy VII Advent Children in 2005, and its director's cut version that came out a few years later. The other Final Fantasy title Nomura directed would be that of Final Fantasy VII Remake that came out in 2020. Other than that, he has mostly been a leading creative voice for several spin-offs of Final Fantasy and numerous other projects that he ended up collaborating on, such as Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo 3DS and Wii U for Nintendo, by having Cloud Strife being a playable character through downloadable content, as well as within the base roster for the more recent Super Smash Bros. Ultimate on the Nintendo Switch. A couple of others would be Xenoblade Chronicles 2 for Monolith Soft in designing the characters of the antagonistic side called Torna, and Terra Battle 2 for Mistwalker Studios in designing a character for Hironobu Sakaguchi. After Final Fantasy X-2 completed development, and with Square Enix's first production department concepting ideas for the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology, with Final Fantasy XIII being the one to lead the multimedia project, other projects started to take shape. One of them would be known as Final Fantasy Agito 13 until it changed its official name to Final Fantasy Type 0, as it was amongst the projects in that meta-series of games. Another title would be a third game called Final Fantasy Versus XIII, and Tetsuya Nomura would be the one in charge of directing the project, making it the first Final Fantasy game he would have in a directing role, aside from directing Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, and Final Fantasy VII Remake making up his first directing role in the series, many years later. Development for Final Fantasy Versus XIII began in 2006, as was being worked on by the development team responsible for the Kingdom Hearts series as a PlayStation 3 exclusive, although Tetsuya Nomura had already conceived the game's concept some years prior. Members of the team behind Final Fantasy VII Advent Children would also take part in the game's development. Not only would Nomura be the director and base story planner for the game, he would also design the game's main characters. As being part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis subseries of Final Fantasy games, and where each game in that series is to be linked by a common mythos with their own interpretations, Versus XIII was to be what Nomura wanted as a heavy departure from the lighthearted nature of the Kingdom Hearts franchise, and more as a darker, mature approach to Final Fantasy XIII. Nomura attributed this move due to his love for the extremes, and explained the direction he took as closer to more of his personal taste and tone that was completely different from what producers had requested him to do in the past. The explanation on the extremes is where a group of heroes stand up against fate so that they can have full control of their destiny. Early in Versus XIII's development, Nomura said that the concept and thinking behind this project was not that fit for a mainline numbered installment to the Final Fantasy franchise, which would be why he chose the game to be a spin-off instead. Not to mention, the move to make him the director of Versus XIII, including the other projects he was a part of, was due to the fact that the series creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, departed from Square Enix in 2003, so the direction of the Final Fantasy franchise's future would need to be attributed by various producers and directors, where Tetsuya Nomura became one of them. Versus XIII would be what Nomura described as the dark side of Final Fantasy XIII, which was emphasized in the game's title. Members of the development team behind Final Fantasy Versus XIII would be Shinji Hashimoto and Yoshinori Kitase as producers. Takeshi Nozue would work on the CGI cutscenes with visual works, as they previously worked on Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Takeyuki Takeo would be the mechanical designer, Jun Akiyama would be the event planning director, Yoko Shimomura would be the main composer of the soundtrack, while contributing her work on the Kingdom Hearts games, games, Yoshitaka Amano would create the game's title logo illustration like he has done for most of the games in the franchise, both mainline and spin-off combined, and Kazushige Nojima would be the overall scenario writer. On top of all these people being a part of the project, Square Enix also signed a contract with the Japanese fashion brand Rowan to help and promote their clothing designs for the characters in the game. In tandem to this, the creative director of Rowan, Hiromu Takahara, would serve as the game's costume designer, as his designs were implemented much later when the game would start to take shape. When Final Fantasy Versus XIII began production in 2006, a CGI concept trailer for the game, along with the other games that were a part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-series, would be shown to the public at E3 in Los Angeles, California. Versus XIII was said to not merely be a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, but a wholly independent story, unfolding in a different world, with different characters. Amongst the first characters introduced in the trailer would be a boy who was the prince and ruler of a kingdom called Lucis that had more of a modern setting, as it was at war with a nation called Niflheim, who wanted to gather the 4 crystals from its rival nations to achieve world domination. The boy's weapon would be comprised of 13 different swords that gave the appearance of crystalline objects protecting him, but fully materializing into physical blades upon physical contact. In 2007, another character shown would be a girl who wields a rapier, and her distinct characteristics would be her mid-length blonde hair and green skirt. Her allegiance would be that to a country called Tenebrae that was in complete control by the Niflheim Empire. She would be in conflict with the prince due to her allegiance, but has a secret relationship with him that may not view her as a full-on antagonist. After the concept footage and screenshots were shown to the public, production would end up being bare bones and slow with updates happening almost on a yearly basis. The game's engine history would also have an influence on Versus XIII's development process. Much like Final Fantasy XIII, Versus XIII was to also implement crystal tools, as its first use was showcased at the 2008 Game Developers Conference, as it displayed both the prince and the girl wearing attire to that of a formal occasion while having a conversation in real time, leaving some speculating that that was the first content actually created for the game. It wouldn't be until sometime later when the DKS 3713 event was held that featured another trailer that retreaded what was shown from E3 2006, along with some new scenes being present. The most noticeable additions would be 3 male characters who work alongside the prince as they are his caretakers, a man who would be the king of Lucis and the prince's father, and overworld transportation in a car, like what was seen from the vehicle transportation in Final Fantasy VIII. Plus, small snippets of the conversation scene between the prince and the girl were also shown. By 2009, the next trailer was an update on the conversation scene during that evening party, but it showcased better lighting from the Crystal Tools engine as well as the scene playing out in its entirety. It would be available as a bonus extra in the 2009 release to the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete. After that trailer was shown, characters would start to implement their costume designs that Hiromu Takahara would create, and the first design of the prince's outfit would be shown in a private theater showcasing of the game's first gameplay footage at the 2009 Tokyo Game Show. The outfit for the prince showed more of him wearing a jacket over his shirt, while wearing jeans with low-knee cutoffs, boots, and a biker glove on his left hand, over the simplistic design that Nomura used as a placeholder from before. Not to mention, the hair of the prince was much shorter than what was seen prior to the newest trailer. However, Tetsuya Nomura commented that the trailer shown was merely a demo and that most footage would not be used in the final game, as he said the clip was to show proof that the game was still in development. The new outfit the prince wore would be put on display during the 2010 Jump Festi event, as the outfit was more modern in its design. For this long period of time between the different trailers appearing at the events and online, some people began speculating that the footage being shown was either Nomura taking his time to not rush the game, or that its development was amongst the lieu of problematic issues that were being plagued in Final Fantasy XIII's development, since each team had trouble with sharing a unified vision. Other people, such as the digital artist who used to work for the Visual Works department of Square Enix, Eiji Kitada, claimed that other projects started to take more precedence than Versus XIII, as he and the modeling supervisor worked on all the pre-production modeling and rendering while working on Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete. Other conflicting reports started to come in that full production of the game was placed on hold so that the team within the first production department could complete Final Fantasy XIII, but was later clarified by Tetsuya Nomura as a mistranslation by stating that members of the Versus XIII XIII team were helping with Final Fantasy XIII in their spare times, as both of their schedules were in tandem to one another. After Final Fantasy XIII was launched, some thought that those resources used in that game could be shifted back into the Versus XIII project, but technical issues were bringing it nearly to a halt. This was also confirmed by Julian Mercerjon, who was formerly the technology director of Versus XIII, as he stated that the universal engine that Motomu Toriyama and his team conceived for Final Fantasy XIII could not handle Versus XIII anymore, because of the latter being more for open-world environments, which the Crystal Tools engine was not built for, and making it virtually unusable to Tetsuya Nomura's own game. The onslaught of problems that Crystal Tools had on Versus XIII's development forced Square Enix to commission the creation of a brand new engine for next-generation consoles, called the Luminous Studio Game Engine. More on that later. Several news stories and interviews on the game's development would happen throughout 2010, with one taking place in May of that year with the annual Square Enix shareholders meeting, as an investor commented on a possible Xbox 360 port of the game since Final Fantasy XIII also came out on that system. Yoichi Wada, Square Enix's then president and CEO at the time, said that they would be looking into the possibility right before a formal announcement, but this was met with some negative backlash from fans online, as it seemed that Square Enix was changing the game from a PlayStation 3 exclusive to a multi-platform release like Final Fantasy XIII. However, Wada commented on the situation, saying that nothing was finalized at that moment in time, so it remains as a PlayStation 3 exclusive for the time being. In the following month of June, new in-game screenshots for Versus XIII were revealed, along with the announcement of its presence at the 2010 Tokyo Game Show, since it skipped out on E3 2010. A few days later, Tetsuya Nomura also made the announcement that Rowan had completed all the costume designs for the characters, and with the scenario being completed as well. In August 2010, Nomura made a brand new announcement that voice casting for the Japanese versions of Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy Versus XIII had begun, along with other bits of news. A few weeks later, Yoshinori Kitase announced during an interview with GamingUnion.net that Versus XIII may not be released until after 2011, delaying the game even further. During the 2010 Tokyo Game Show a short time later, Square Enix announced that they planned to present Final Fantasy Versus XIII in a January 2011 press conference, which was also part of their Fabula Nova Crystallis conference in relation to all things toward Final Fantasy XIII. Around that same time, a 30-second trailer for the game had been leaked onto the internet that showed everyone the prince's new design while briefly running through areas shown in previous screenshots, and ended with him fighting a mechanical behemoth with instances of blood gushing out from the slashes of the sword that was made by the boy. In October 2010, the combined trailer for both Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy Versus XIII from the 2010 Tokyo Game Show were officially released on the internet through the Japanese Square Enix members' website. From the game's announcement in 2006, along with what was all shown until 2010, people's patience was largely running thin by the lack of anything brand new in Versus XIII's development. It wouldn't be until January 2011 when Final Fantasy Versus XIII was finally showcased in a much-needed update. In the trailer, new footage was shown of material not seen by the public for the first time, and more emphasis was placed on the overall gameplay, since that did not seem to take any shape from prior announcements. In the new trailer, voice acting from the Japanese side was shown for the prince and his subordinates when fighting monsters and soldiers of the Niflheim Empire. It would also mark the first time that the press and gamers would know the final names of the characters present. The prince would be known as a boy named Noctis Lucis Caelum, as he would be amongst the bloodline of rulers within the kingdom of Lucis in a city called Insomnia. His caretakers would be a hulking brute by the name of Gladiolus Amicitia, Noctis's personal assistant would be named Ignis Scientia, and Noctis's close friend from his school days would be a playful wielder of firearms named Prompto Argentum. The lady with the blonde hair and green skirt from earlier trailers would be known as Stella Nox Fleuret, and Noctis's father would be named Regis Lucius Caelum. The leader of Niflheim would also be revealed under the name Aedolus Aldercapt, along with a female dragoon of the Highwind lineage who was not named at that time. Within the gameplay itself, it played out more like Kingdom Hearts with its real-time combat, and the animations were much more detailed. Noctis could switch between his blades, along with using them to warp at specific spots he chose, and he attacked enemies by warping at them from short to extremely long distances, while acting as a balanced member when it comes to his overall strength. Gladio would use a great sword, and do massive damage to any enemy he came into contact with, Ignis would use a katana to attack and have magic spells at his disposal, and Prompto would use guns, as his gameplay could be done in the style of third-person shooters, very similar to what was seen in games like the more recent Resident Evil games and Gears of War. There was also the possibility that the 4 characters could pilot mechanical vehicles, such as two-legged mechs and tanks to fire off missiles from its cannon to do massive damage on their enemies. It would have also been possible for players to swap between different characters, as they could play each and every one of them with their own unique playstyles to give the game more variety in the combat. Finally, some of the gameplay had more cinematic elements happening in real time, such as running on a bridge with incoming missiles from Imperial airships of Niflheim trying to attack Noctis running on there, to battling a group of Niflheim soldiers on top of one of their airships. Reactions to the trailer have been overwhelmingly positive, as the high quality level of polish, being able to control the different characters, and the variety in the different playstyles made the game look really impressive for what was considered to be a spin-off that was much lower in scale than to that of the original Final Fantasy XIII. It was enough to raise some heads for those who have given up on the game, as they felt it was on the verge of cancellation because of the small updates happening here and there. However, it would be the last update that people would get to see for quite a while, as more trials and tribulations would occur in Versus XIII's development. In the summer of 2011, Square Enix got its first look at the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, as they were currently being produced between Sony and Microsoft, and they both threatened to make the PlayStation 3 exclusive of Tetsuya Nomura's Final Fantasy game become irrelevant before it was even finished. In other words, sticking to the origins and hardware the game was being worked on was no longer a suitable option, as changes needed to be made in order for the project to keep going. In July 2011, Tetsuya Nomura was interviewed during that time and revealed that Versus XIII still had not entered full production, and the next showing of the game had been set. That following month saw Square Enix renewing the trademark for Final Fantasy Versus XIII, while the month after that brought about a fan meeting where Yoshinori Kitase commented on Versus XIII's development by saying that the first production department were giving 100% to development so it can be a reality. The next year would be the most ambidextrous when it came to the development of Final Fantasy Versus XIII, as no footage or any new work in progress would be presented within that whole year. Tetsuya Nomura would continue to make comments on the game's development, such as the ratio between real-time cutscenes and pre-rendered cutscenes would be around 7:3, and that the next time the game would be shown would use real-time footage. In July 2012, rumors were starting to spread that Final Fantasy Versus XIII was silently cancelled since no new work in progress was showcased and to not cause public outcry and backlash. Fortunately, Yuichi Wada debunked the rumors by hinting that the next work in progress would surprise fans, particularly with the game's city environments. On September 1st, 2012, Square Enix held an event for the 25th anniversary of the Final Fantasy franchise, with Nomura doing a sketch of Noctis along with the phrase, "Congratulations on the 25th anniversary. Please wait for his turn to appear," and the next month with him reiterating that the game was still live and in development. What many of those eagerly awaiting the game did not know was that the year 2012 was when drastic changes were made to the game's development. It was during that year when Square Enix decided to shift the game's development to next-generation consoles, as was during 2012 when third parties started to get development kits for both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and it was decided by the company to officially rebrand Versus XIII as the next mainline installment after Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn was being worked on. During that July, while alleviating fears over the rumors of Versus XIII's cancellation, Wada ordered the team behind Final Fantasy Type 0 to work on Final Fantasy Versus XIII, as well as creating a prototype of Final Fantasy running on next-generation consoles. The team working on Versus XIII started at around 200 workers before being downsized by 90% in 2012, before the arrival of the Final Fantasy Type 0 team, who were led by Hajime Tabata. Having the team of Hajime Tabata and the Final Fantasy Type 0 team working on Versus XIII would be part of Square Enix's massive restructuring effort that would give birth to their second business division that mostly made up of core members of the overall Final Fantasy team. By the time December rolled around, Hajime Tabata became the co-director to finish the project, and he would eventually transition as the game's newest director, and he would succeed Tetsuya Nomura overall. When the newly established team was finalized, Nomura and Tabata sat down to discuss the direction of Final Fantasy Versus XIII being the next mainline game in the overall franchise, along with needing to ensure how characters like Noctis could be used in the best possible way. Tabata would later state that when Final Fantasy Versus XIII transitioned to the next numbered installment, development of Versus XIII was only a quarter complete of its full production. Seeing the massive scale and scope of what Tetsuya Nomura in the first production department originally conceived for Final Fantasy Versus XIII, Hajime Tabata spearheaded a massive restructuring effort where the overall scope would fit for a single game, but it would also mean that even most well-publicized parts of Versus XIII would end up on the chopping block, such as certain characters and features like the switching between characters in battle. 2013 would be the big year that Versus XIII would finally resurface to the masses. As more rumors, quotes, and updates were being made, it would not be until E3 2013 during the Sony press conference that Tetsuya Nomura appeared in a video as he acknowledged that not much information on the project had been released of late and couldn't share any immediate details as new information would arrive within the coming days. Immediately following that message, a brand new trailer would be revealed during the press conference as it showed newer locations and brand new characters revealed for the first time, such as a man with a long coat and a fedora who is Niflheim's Chancellor to Idolus Aldercapt. The end of the trailer showed the logo and name still being Final Fantasy Versus XIII, but a change happens to the logo as the game would be now branded and renamed into Final Fantasy XV, with its development now moved onto both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. The news of Versus XIII now being officially Final Fantasy XV took the world by surprise, as no one would have expected a game such as that to be the next mainline title to the overall franchise. Even though it would be a shock to the gaming world that this abruptly happened, the origins of Final Fantasy Versus XIII transitioning to Final Fantasy XV dates back to its pre-production days. While Tetsuya Nomura was busy helping the first production department in creating Versus XIII, and with him claiming that making it a numbered installment to the main lineup of Final Fantasy games was not that ideal to begin with, talks about Versus XIII transforming into the next numbered entry began appearing as early as 2007. The talks in relation to this was based on the fact that the scale and scope for Versus XIII was growing at a grueling pace, that it would have been best to make it an original number title instead. For example, when Final Fantasy Agito 13 was renamed into Final Fantasy Type 0, and with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were presented to Square Enix, it was decided to port the game onto those consoles for an HD release. Since both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were designed around a DirectX 11 based development structure that made it easier to port games on next-generation consoles, the PlayStation 3 was abandoned to shift Versus XIII onto its successor. Another presumed reason was because of Versus XIII's protracted development and escalating budget that it forced the game to be rebranded as Final Fantasy XV. For being the first original game in the overall franchise to lead on to 8th generation platforms, Final Fantasy XV would end up using the Luminous Studio engine instead of Crystal tools, as the next generation engine could handle the kind of scope that Tetsuya Nomura originally envisioned for the project. By turning more in favor of the new game engine, it would allow game textures up to 4K resolution to be placed onto the environments, characters, and monsters while being downscaled to a game that would render in 1080p, making its detail that much higher in its quality. There was even a point where Nomura wanted to make the game into a musical after watching the 2012 film adaptation of Les Miserables, but that decision ended up being vetoed by the higher-ups within the company. Since the transition between games, a restructuring of staff members was in place in light of this new development. Even though staff members such as Yoko Shimomura, Shinji Hashimoto, and Takeshi Nozue would remain in their respective positions for the game's development, several high-profile members such as Yoshinori Kitase and Kazushige Nojima ended up being replaced, with Shinji Hashimoto now being the only producer of the game, and with a new scenario writer by the name of Saori Itamuro using Nojima's original scenario as a base for the new work. Yusuke Naora and Isamu Kamikokurio would join alongside Tomohiro Hasegawa for the game's direction of art. Non-Japanese staff members included a character designer by the name of Roberto Ferrari, a game designer from Thailand who would be called Sun by his teammates due to the difficult pronunciation of his name, and party interaction designer Juan Hosmer. The staff as formed in 2012 was a combination between the Final Fantasy Versus XIII and Type 0 development teams, and by 2014, between 200 and 300 people were working on the game, easily making it the biggest team for a game after Final Fantasy XIII. In addition to the Versus XIII and Type 0 development teams forming together, several other development studios were brought onto the project, such as Hexadrive with engineering the game, XBEC Entertainment who helped out in designing the later sections of the game, the Shanghai company Plus Smile with designing the buildings, licensed middleware from Umbra to help boost the game's graphics, and Streamline Studios to help with technical development. Avalanche Studios, the people behind the Just Cause franchise, was thought of being brought onto the development of Final Fantasy XV, with creating the game's airship mechanics after an announcement was made in 2015, but it ended up being not true, as Avalanche Studios showed Square Enix's business division 2 their level of detailed development methods that helped them in creating the game's airship mechanics. Tetsuya Nomura stayed as the game's director for as long as he could, so that the team could meet his original vision as much as possible, and by December 2013, he relieved himself from that duty, and gave Hajime Tabata full responsibility from that point on to bring the project to its full completion. Even the separate engine, gameplay, graphics, and design sections of the team were merged into a single unit, so that they could all help with each other throughout the whole development. After Hajime Tabata became the full-time director and succeeding where Tetsuya Nomura left off, it became a stalwart and arduous task for him to get the project completed, but several changes from the game would take effect as a result. Development for Final Fantasy XV initially followed the pattern of previous high-budget games, but the team eventually realized that such a development method became outdated. This realization made Tabata and the team express to the higher-ups within Square Enix in making them understand that their development methods for Final Fantasy games during that time was a sole reason as to why the overall franchise was constantly within this downhill slope in quality. Naoki Yoshida also saw this after Final Fantasy XIV was originally released. In lieu to adjusting to this new development cycle for their AAA games, Tabata's main concern when developing Final Fantasy XV was keeping the game's development on schedule, instead of delaying it when experimentation with the technology ever came up. Square Enix also kept the game's budget under strict control, despite the prolonged development it already endured. Another major issue for the team was that they were trying to decide what elements from Final Fantasy Versus XIII would be carried over to Final Fantasy XV, including ones that had to be changed or fully discarded, since the project was already known and fans had their expectations high when seeing previous material. One of these major changes that took place was the complete discardment of the female lead, Stella Nox Fleuret. Instead, she would be succeeded by another character named Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, as she was worked into the game's story to where her role in the plot actually made sense. When Versus XIII transitioned into 15, story elements along the line of a game in the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology that surrounded certain deities like Etro ended up being changed and discarded to make Final Fantasy XV stand out on its own, and Stella's role within the new direction of the story was actually making little sense to the developers. Thus, Stella was reworked as Lunafreya so that she would be a completely different character where her importance made more sense than retaining Stella, as keeping the former would make her character less well received than when she was shown in Versus XIII. When consulted over this proposed change, Kazushige Nojima stated that he would be content with this decision as long as the overall concept remained faithful to his and Tetsuya Nomura's original vision, giving the team much-needed confidence to make the necessary changes. Hajime Tabata also emphasized his attitude toward the game's overall development by citing that the team setup was quote-unquote horizontal, using a non-hierarchical staff structure to help speed up the exchange of input and feedback between departments. This type of change was a drastic shift from what was already being done at the company and by Japanese video game developers in general, and it was mostly met with a mixed reaction from staff, as some were overjoyed by this new freedom, while others felt it downgraded them as newer possibilities could not be experimented on. During the game's presentation at the 2014 Tokyo Game Show, the real-time demonstration footage showcased the graphical capabilities of the Luminous Studio engine and the effect of environmental changes within the gameplay. To have players get a better understanding of the game for their own eyes while waiting, Square Enix released an international demo called Final Fantasy XV, Episode Duskai, and it was released for players to get a good look at the game due to its long absence after being shown off at E3 2013. The demo also showed the real-time gameplay it was going for, and the fact that the game was definitely being developed. For the first time, gamers got to hear the English voice cast for the main party members. The only criticism within the cast was the deepness of Nox's voice, as he sounded very old for someone who is at the age of 20 in the game. Episode de Sky became available for the first 2 months when players bought Final Fantasy Type 0 HD for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One through the game's Day 1 edition, and then it became available on the digital storefronts after that. While players could save their progress in the demo, save data could not be transferred from the demo to the main game when it would release, but the developers promised a bonus for those who purchased the demo. A patch for the demo was released in June 2015, with a number of enhancements in its gameplay and presentation after Square Enix received so much feedback on what they could do to improve the experience. At the time of the demo's release, it was running on version 1.5 of the Luminous Studio engine, as the full game would end up running on version 2.0 after its arrival. As Final Fantasy XV continued with its development that was already prolonged to begin with, something big was also being worked on for the game from behind the scenes. In the E3 2013 trailer, Tetsuya Nomura explained that sequels to Final Fantasy XV were hinted at, as the game would have a self-contained climax that would be the first part of an intended continued epic. He also stated that Square Enix was considering the use of online elements and developing shorter standalone titles to keep players interested to avoid long waiting times between them. This type of move was interpreted as the company leaning towards a digitally distributed episodic format for possible sequels. Nomura later clarified this at the 2013 Japan Expo by stating that no plans for sequels had been finalized, leading many to believe that Final Fantasy XV would indeed be a single complete experience. It would most certainly be the case when Hajime Tabata was interviewed about this, as he did not want Final Fantasy XV to have multiple endings or a cliffhanger ending, as he did not want the game to emulate the narrative style that Final Fantasy XIII went for. Despite this wish, the scale of Final Fantasy XV's world and story would have needed multiple games to tell the entire tale. To avoid the need of creating sequels of a continued linear story, the team instead would produce additional media surrounding the main game, turning it into a multimedia project, with the emphasis of having these smaller scale projects be ideal introductions for newcomers, while the main game could still be enjoyed on its own. While many of these smaller scale projects would be in the works, Square Enix held a large media event for Final Fantasy XV on March 30th, 2016 at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, California. It would be live to those who attended the event, as well as live streamed on the internet for people to view at home, and it would be known as Uncovered Final Fantasy XV, with it being hosted by both Greg Miller and Tim Geddes from Kinda Funny Games on the Internet. The event lasted between 1 to 2 hours with several announcements in relation to Final Fantasy XV. One of the biggest announcements to commemorate this special occasion was the special guest appearance of the creator of the overall franchise, Hironobu Sakaguchi, attending the event in his honor. Nobuo Uematsu made an appearance on video during the event, expressing how his time was too busy with the Distant World's Final Fantasy concerts from around the world that it was impossible to work on Final Fantasy XV's soundtrack. Yoshitaka Amano made a guest appearance along with Sakaguchi as well. Big announcements came in for the event, such as the announcement of a second demo called the Platinum Demo, as it gave people a glimpse at the environment and physics that were all present in the Luminous Studio Engine 2.0 after Episode de Sky, free DLC of Noctis' companion Eidolon Carbuncle after completing the demo, Florence and the Machine singing the main song for the game, which would be a classical rendition of Stand By Me that was sung by the late Benny King. The full use of the main character's main mode of transportation would be King Regis' car called the Regalia, and the announcement of small-scale games such as Justice Monsters 5, as it played out more as a pinball game that became free to download on smartphones, as well as being playable in the main game upon its release. However, the two biggest announcements during that time were that of a 5-episode original video animation called Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV that focuses on how Noctis, Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto became friends with their own backstories, and a full-length CGI film known as Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV that takes place after Noctis and his friends left Insomnia that focuses on the characters of King Regis and Lunafreya before the city's downfall by the Niflheim Empire. The titles in relation to Final Fantasy XV would be part of this new media empire, which Square Enix would dub as the Final Fantasy XV universe, and it took more efforts in its franchising than what was done for Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, the Evil East Alliance, and Final Fantasy XIII in the past. At the end of the presentation, Final Fantasy XV was announced for a worldwide release on September 30th, 2016, and 4 versions of the game would release on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. A standard version was made as a regular release. A Day 1 edition would have DLC for the Masamune blade to be wielded by either Noctis or Gladio, with its appearance being vastly different to the one Sephiroth wielded in Final Fantasy VII, along with platform exclusive material such as Xbox Live avatars and themes on the PlayStation 4. A deluxe edition came with a Blu-ray copy of Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV, a steel bookcase featuring Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, and promotional content such as an additional outfit for Noctis and a recolor of the regalia would be present. Finally, the Ultimate Collector's Edition included all the content from the Deluxe Edition, as well as a Blu-ray copy of Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV, a special soundtrack, a hardcover art book, further promotional content in the form of in-game items, and a PlayArts Kai figurine of Noctis. Pre-orders went live after the event, with only 30,000 units of the Ultimate Collector's Edition of the game between the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One would be produced, as it was hard to stay on top of demand for the figurine of Noctis, but an additional 10,000 units were made for all over the world much later. On top of all the announcements for Final Fantasy XV, Square Enix promised a big marketing campaign for the game with Uncovered Final Fantasy XV, and its announcements being the start of it all, and several video podcasts with new updates on the game through Square Enix's YouTube channel known as the Active Time Report would happen all the way up to the game's release, with there being occasional appearances from the director, Hajime Tabata. The first project to release that held any significance to Final Fantasy XV would be the 5-episode anime called Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV, and its first episode was released on the day of the Uncovered Final Fantasy XV event, with all subsequent episodes being streamed on YouTube for free up until the game's release. Square Enix and A1 Pictures would team up together to work on this anime after A1 Pictures worked on the short animated film called On the Way to a Smile in the Blu-ray release of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete. The dialogue would all be spoken in Japanese, although several bilingual subtitles would be created for those in every specific region. Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV focuses on the characters of Noctis, Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto undergoing their journey through Lucis before they leave for the independent island city of Altissia, with 3 out of 5 of the episodes focusing on how each of Noctis's allies became good friends with the prince. The first episode focuses primarily on Noctis, which tells his backstory about how he came into contact with the monsters called demons within the game's world. The second one focuses on Prompto, as he was originally an overweight student at Noctis' school who came into contact with one of Luna's puppies and is asked to be Noc's friend for taking care of it. The third episode focuses on Gladio, as he initially viewed Noctis as a spoiled and self-centered child when training him on how to use a sword, but comes to greatly respect him when the prince helped Gladio's little sister Iris from staying out of trouble. The fourth episode focuses on Ignis, with how he was originally tasked by King Regis to be Noctis' personal confidant and caretaker. The final episode picks back up where episode 1 ended, and it showcases how the individual meetings that everyone had with Noctis helped shape up a strong and deep brotherhood between all 4 friends. Overall reactions to the anime were very positive than what Square Enix and A1 Pictures had anticipated, as it acted as a great appetizer for those who really wanted to play the game. While there were some criticisms, such as the first episode being weak with its storytelling, and with the last episode being heavily focused on action, the ones revolving around the other characters and their meetings with Noctis would shine very brightly in the anime's overall delivery. Episode 1 would achieve over 3,600,000 views upon its release, with Episode 2 hitting over 1,300,000 views, both Episode 3 and 4 hitting near the 900,000 mark in views, and Episode 5 being the lowest with nearly 300,000 views. When Final Fantasy XV released, additional scenes featuring Lunafreya Nox Fleuret would be present in the Blu-ray release of the anime when it came packaged with the Ultimate Collector's Edition of the game. In the end, overall reactions to the anime remained generally positive to this very day. In between the episodic releases of Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV happening between March 30th to September 17th, 2016, Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV would be the next project that would come out of the Final Fantasy XV universe. During the Uncovered Final Fantasy XV presentation, the lead roles for the CGI film would be Noctis' father and the current king of Lucis within the city of Insomnia, Regis Lucis Caelum, Noctis' betrothed, and oracle to help those who are suffering at the tragedies within the world, Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, and a brand new character who's a member of high-rank soldiers that are ordered in protecting the king at all times, as well as the movie's main protagonist, Nyx Ulrich. With these characters shown, they would be voiced by high-profile actors from Hollywood such as Aaron Paul from Breaking Bad voicing Nix Ulrich, Lena Headey from the Frank Miller film 300 and Game of Thrones would voice Lunafreya in the movie, and Sean Bean from Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring and Game of Thrones would be the voice of King Regis. Several other well-known actors such as David Gant, Trevor Duvall, and well-known voice actors such as Darren DePaul and Todd Haberkorn would voice some of the other characters who were well-known to the plot from past material. Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV was created by Square Enix's own subsidiary of full-motion video sequences in their games known as Visual Works, and this would be their second full-length film to work on after Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Takeshi Nozue would be the director, Kosei Ito, Larry Sparks, Shinji Hashimoto, and Hajime Tabata would serve as the producers of the film. The story was conceived by Kazushige Nojima and Saori Itamuro, while Takashi Hasegawa would provide the screenplay, and the music would be a combined effort between American film composer John Roderick Graham and Japanese video game musician Yoko Shimomura. Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV would have a limited theatrical release on July 9th, 2016, with its commercial release through streaming and download services on August 30th, 2016, and its DVD and Blu-ray release arriving on October 4th, 2016. The movie takes place within the kingdom of Lucis, as they and the Niflheim Empire have been at war for quite some time, and the events run parallel after Noctis and his friends left Insomnia for quite some time to meet up with Luna. 12 years prior, when both Regis and Noctis were visiting the neutral country of Tenebrae for visitation of Queen Sylva and Princess Lunafreya, with Noctis recuperating from a near-death experience, both the king and prince are targeted for assassination by Niflheim, as they invade and slay the queen while both Luna and her older brother, Rebrand Nox Fleuret, stay behind as they become subjects under the Empire's rule. At the present time, the king's personal army, known as the Kingsglaive, are protecting the borders within the Lucis continent while fighting off against the Niflheim Empire, along with their army of Magitech soldiers and demons amongst their control. During this ongoing conflict, Niflheim's imperial chancellor named Arden Azunia makes a guest appearance within Lucis's throne as he offers a declaration of peace between both nations to King Regis, who has been growing weaker with accelerated aging as he is bonded with the kingdom's crystal to protect it and imbue him with magic in creating the barrier that protects the city. Regis accepts Chancellor Azunia's proposal, which causes dissension amongst the Kingsglaive military as they feel that what the king is doing would be him abandoning their families, which is seen by many who are associated with Nyx, such as Libertas Ostium and Crow Altius. 2 days before the peace treaty, Crow is ordered on a mission by King Regis to escort Lunafreya to Lucis, but is killed en route by unknown circumstances. Her death causes Libertas to retire from the Kingsglaive and join a group of Lucian rebels who despise Regis's leadership. On the night before the signing of the treaty, a party is held where both Regis and Niflheim's emperor, Aedolas Aldercapt, are in attendance. Luna meets with Nyx at the party, but is secretly abducted by a general of Niflheim named Glocka. Nyx shortly discovers that Luna has been kidnapped and finds that the Empire has stationed their Magitech army and demons and Magitech ships just outside of Insomnia, learning that their declaration of peace is nothing but a ruse to come in and easily take away the crystal. On the day of the peace treaty, Nyx informs Regis about the impending news, and the king orders the Kingsglaive to board the Magitech ships to stop them from coming in, despite that their commander, Titos Dratos, has gone missing. Nyx and the Kingsglaive enter the ship, and succeed in rescuing Lunafreya from Niflheim captivity, but in a shocking turn of events, many of the Kingsglaive turn on him when most of them became in cahoots with the Lucian rebels wanting to overthrow Regis as their rebel leader, Luce Lazarus, tries and attacks both Nyx and Luna. Nyx and Luna manage to survive the ongoing battle, as all the former members of the Kingsglaive who tried to kill Nyx have all perished, only for Lazarus to survive from impending doom. When the peace treaty is about to begin from Insomnia, the Niflheim delegation springs into action with killing the ruling council by forcing Regis's retreat to safety, but the Magitech army and the Lucian rebels work together in destroying the wall that protects Insomnia, only to be subsequently massacred in the process. Nyx and Luna arrive back to the royal capital by reaching the citadel where Regis is located, as he is battling Glocka only for him to lose the Ring of the Lucii and meet his death at the hands of the enemy general. Nyx and Luna retrieve the ring and retreat on the king's order as he is dying after the outcome of his battle, while both Aldercapt and Azunia successfully steal the crystal in their possession and flee back to Niflheim by airship. flagship, only with them leaving Insomnia to be destroyed by Niflheim's demons. The missing commander of the Kingsglaive, Titus Dratos, contacts both Nyx and Lunafreya to meet him at the plaza, only to be cornered by Luce of the Lucian rebels and reveals himself to be Crow's killer. Both Lazarus and Nyx fight each other, as the rebel almost succeeds in killing Ulrich in battle, but is tricked by Luna into putting on the Ring of the Lucii that results in his death. Dratos appears out of nowhere to help both Nyx and Luna escape, but he is ran over by Libertus in a car, only to come out unscathed, and revealed to in fact be General Glocka of Niflheim. Just as Glocka is about to kill all three in his sight, Nyx tries to put on the Ring of the Lucii, and he comes into contact with the spirits of the past kings of Lucis, only to be initially rejected of their help since Ulrich is not amongst the Lucis bloodline. However, Nyx resolved to eliminate the demons in the city, and the threat they posed to the crystal persuades the past kings to grant Ulrich their magic to fight back. While fending off Glocka and earning the powers of the ring, Nyx gives the ring back to Lunafreya before entrusting her to Libertus and telling them to flee. With the ring's borrowed power, he engages Glocka in a final battle while battling on top of a large army of demons in the form of diamond weapons, as animating the city statues of the past rulers known as the Old Wall allows Nyx and them to fend off against Niflheim's demons. As the night finally dies down with dawn approaching, the demons within Insomnia are all destroyed. Nyx mortally wounds Glocka, and he dies shortly thereafter as payment for using the ring's power. With his dying breath, Nyx wishes for Noctis to greatly rule the kingdom of Lucis in the future. In the aftermath of Insomnia's destruction, the sole survivor of Regis's Kingsglaive military, Libertus Ostium, tries to escort Luna out of the city, but she tells him to stay behind, as she leaves with the Ring of the Lucii, along with fleeing survivors, to search and find Noctis, so that she can honor Regis's last wish. Upon its release, Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV was met with a largely negative response from critics, while popular opinion of the general public held a more positive response. In the eyes of critics, they felt that the movie only served as a long cinematic cutscene for fans of Final Fantasy XV, rather than having a well-written and cohesive plot. While the overall visuals and efforts from the lead voice cast were universally praised, the overall story was largely criticized. The plot was mostly bogged down by the political elements and the action from within the war sequences and fighting between characters, only for people to feel greatly confused as to what is all going on, since they have no knowledge to the overall lore within Final Fantasy XV. Others felt that the movie held a poor portrayal of female characters like Lunafreya, which Hironobu Sakaguchi was in the complete opposite of with his impressions, and that the story only focuses on setting up for the events of the game that was about to arrive. Some were mixed at the delivery of the film, as they thought that Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV held promise, but relied too much on character stereotypes and world building, as it was nothing but a gorgeous overstuffed slice of fan service. On the side of those who were mostly positive, there were some critics who shared the same popular opinion as the general public. Many thought that the movie was an expert blend of world building, humanity, and the magical strangeness of Final Fantasy, while balancing its scene setting up for Final Fantasy XV, with creating a relatable experience in addition to its visuals and relatable characters. There were even those who felt that the movie was a first step by Square Enix to regain fan trust after earlier missteps the franchise has taken for quite a while. Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV grossed over $6.5 million during its limited theatrical run, and earned a further $3.9 million in revenue from its DVD and Blu-ray releases. At face value, some could possibly see the movie as nothing but another commercial flop, but its high takings that were attributed to positive word of mouth following the initial release could be said otherwise. The general opinion surrounding Final Fantasy XV after Brotherhood and Kingsglaive released may have left some as indifferent or as a precursor to an uninteresting story within the main game that was to arrive, but those who enjoyed both the anime and movie were becoming more anxious on what to expect for the game. As its release date was inching closer to September 30th, rumors during the month of August started to spread that the game may have been delayed once more by 2 more months. Hajime Tabata took the time and liberty to address this rumor sometime later by stating that the game would indeed be delayed to November of that year, as well as delivering an official apology for those who were still anticipating its release. Tabata's reason for the delay was that the team was not fully satisfied with the game's overall quality they were aiming for, so the extra time would be dedicated to further polish of the product. Plus, he felt that a day one patch would be completely unnecessary, as he wanted to give players without an internet connection the full experience right at the get-go. In a later interview, Tabata confirmed that he was the one who requested the extension of further polishing the game after the master disc had been created for mass distribution. Luckily, it would be the last delay that would ever happen for Final Fantasy XV, as it would finally be on track for a release during the 2016 holiday season from around the world. On top of the game being initially created as another project within the Fabula Nova Crystallis mythology to becoming a new mainline installment to the overall franchise to stand out as its own thing, the development cycle lasted for exactly 10 years after both Tetsuya Nomura and Kazushige Nojima conceived what the game was to be about. Fans who were anticipating the game were blessed that the game finally became a thing, while those who were not holding out on hope were immediately labeling the game as nothing but vaporware, and it would surpass any other Final Fantasy game with having the longest development cycle in the series' history, while not being the game with the longest development cycle, as Duke Nukem Forever still holds on to that title. After several experiments in place in the game's development, numerous revisions to the overall story to become what it is, and placing enough passion and dedication to the overall project within the last 10 years, Final Fantasy XV would finally see a worldwide release on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One on November 29th, 2016. Final Fantasy XV takes place within the world of Eos, as it is comprised of 3 continents, with most of the story taking place on the continent of Lucis, where several regions make up its overall geography. Other continents would be that of Accordo, where the independent city of Altissia resides, and the other would be that of the Imperial continent that is ruled by the Niflheim Empire, with Tenebrae being a subject of its rule. The game would star Noctis Lucius Caelum as the game's main protagonist, as he is the Prince of Lucis who is en route to Altissia to marry his betrothed, Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, in accordance to a peace treaty between Lucis and Niflheim. He comes off as a shy man who has trouble expressing his true feelings to those he is very close to, while acting as an equal to his comrades who are not of royalty. Despite this, his royal upbringing shines through his body language, poise, and posture in contrast to his team, but tends to have somewhat of a lazy attitude as seen from his early childhood, even if he acts a bit crass. His comrades would be that of Gladiolus Amicitia, a hulking brute and childhood friend of Noctis who acts as the Crown Prince's shield when in conflict, and from those who are about to strike at him, Ignis Gientia, an advisor to the royal family, as well as the group's driver and chef who must always think about the future and well-being of the prince, and Prompto Argentum, a childhood friend of Noctis during their school days, as well as a wielder of firearms and a guru at taking pictures on any occasion, while having a laid-back and goofy personality. Aside from the main party in the game, other side characters would be present, such as Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, who plays a much bigger role in the game's events than she did in Kingsglaive, and she has an advisor named Gentiana who helps Luna on her path with being the Oracle to save Eos from any danger and to move Noctis in the right direction. Other characters include Noctis' father and fallen king of Lucis named Regis Lucius Caelum, the leader of Lucis' crown guard named Corleonis, Gladio's little sister named Iris Amicitia, and a female dragoon of the Highwind lineage named Aranea Highwind. The Imperial Chancellor, Arden Azunia, returns from Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV as a man who desires the peace between Lucis and Niflheim, but those objectives act as a cover-up for his true goals, which places him as the game's main antagonist. Emperor Idolus Aldercapt and Ravus Nox Fleuret are also present within the game's antagonistic forces, along with others who have only one-time appearances such as Caligo Uldor, Loki Tomelt, and Verstale Besithia. Eos' history begins from over thousands of years in the past, as the world was created by a race of beings that descended from the higher plane. This race would create the game's Eidolons known as the Astrals, and all 6 of them became a key part in Eos' creation process: Titan, the Archean; Rama, the Fulgurian; Leviathan, the Hydrian; Shiva, the Glacian; Ifrit, the Infernian; and the leader being Bahamut, the Draconian. The mysterious beings retreated from the world while leaving the Astrals behind to become a race of their own, with their own language and agendas, and a wish to protect the natural world. A nation called Solheim prospered during the time when Eos was under the watchful eye of the 6 Astrals as it became technologically advanced with its Magitech armor and airship technology. However, Ifrit did not take kindly to this, as he betrayed Solheim and the rest of his brethren that led into a conflict called the Great War of Old, with Solheim meeting its doom after a mysterious parasite massacred its populace by transforming all living things into demons due to dark miasma exuding from their bodies. This plague would be called the Star Scourge, and Ifrit unleashed it so that people could transform into monsters. Due to his rage and evil behavior, the other Astrals worked together and killed Ifrit for his wrongdoing, as he was too impure to save. The Astrals formed a pact with those who would be amongst the royal bloodline of Lucis with the crystal, a source of great magical power, and the Ring of the Lucii, that can help those within the Caelum dynasty wield the crystal's power. These gifts would be given to the first king of Lucis in accordance to this pact, as he would be the one to rid the demons and Star Scourge with the crystal. But he would not be the only one with the title of helping those suffering from the sickness and long night being fastly spread. While the kingdom of Lucis would serve in purging the Star Scourge and fighting demons in battle, the kingdom of Tenebrae would have healers to help those who have become infected by the sickness, while helping the king of Lucis become the chosen king. These divine messengers who can communicate with the Astrals and heal people from the Star Scourge are known with the title of Oracle, as they act more as healers than fighters. Even though it would seem that saving Eos from any more danger would come within the Astrals' grasp, an unfortunate circumstance would ultimately occur. When the first man to be the true king fought alongside the Astrals to get rid of the Star Scourge, he absorbed the miasma into himself, only for it to taint his soul and curse him with the gift of immortality. Even though he was on his way to becoming the chosen king to save Eos from eternal night, using an outlandish tactic like what he did made the Astrals oust him from his goal, as they immediately became in favor of another to be the true king to cleanse Eos of the disease. Being ousted by the Astrals led this man to be bitter with hatred and rage, as he vows to end the Caelum bloodline in retaliation to their betrayal by slaying the true king they choose. It wouldn't be until 2,000 years later when the story would pick up at present events. Lunafreya would be chosen as the Oracle, while it would be her mission to help Noctis become the true king, to rid of the Star Scourge that is about to arrive back, after many long years of slumber. Just like most of the recent games in the series to incorporate voice acting, Final Fantasy XV would follow suit. Noctis would be voiced by Ray Chase.
Don't know about you, but I'm ready as I'll ever be.
As this would be his best known role for any character to this very day. Gladiolus is voiced by Chris Parson.
Knocked! I gotcha! Pull yourself up!
Ignis would be voiced by Adam Crosdell.
A dark one, as it were. A frontal assault would leave us exposed, but if we move under cover of night, we might be able to infiltrate the base unnoticed.
And Prompto would be voiced by Robbie Damon.
I'm sorry for intruding on Noct time. Well, I'll head back then. Night.
Darren DePaul and Trevor Duvall would once again voice Arden Azunia and Ravis Nox Fleuret after voicing them in Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV.
I'm an impatient traveler, ready to turn ship. A man of no consequence.
A moot point, while the fugitives remain at large.
But Sean Bean and Lena Headey would not return to voice King Regis or Lunafreya respectively. Instead, their voice actors for the video game would be both Jim Peary and Amy Shields.
Take heed. Once you set forth, you cannot turn back.
It is in receiving mercy that men offer praise, and in shedding grace that the gods elicit worship.
Other well-known voice actors such as Stephen Blum, Matthew Mercer, and Eden Regal would voice some of the other characters, but Kari Walgren would return to voice Aranea Highwind after voicing both Shelk and Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII and Ash in Final Fantasy XII. This game's portrayal of the character Cid would come in two different types, much like Final Fantasy XII. Instead, they would be in the guise of both a male and female. The male would be a man named Cid Sophiar, who is a retired mechanic that is a longtime friend of King Regis, while his granddaughter, Cindy Oram, would succeed in his favor, as she would be the hero's own mechanic. In the Japanese version, she is referred to as Sydney, since she is featured as the first female Cid in the franchise, but the English release refers to her as Cindy due to reasons unknown. Just like Final Fantasy XII, certain characters come with different accents and dialects to reflect the different locations they would reside at or their mannerisms due to their professions. For the first time in the series since it was being promoted as Final Fantasy Versus XIII, before being called Final Fantasy XV, its whole emphasis would go around the tagline, a fantasy based on reality, meaning that it would have more realistic tones in its atmosphere and not just over-the-top action with the tongue-in-cheek presentation from what was seen in past games. Final Fantasy XV begins with Noctis and his friends leaving Insomnia upon his father's behalf to marry Lunafreya in accordance to Lucis and Niflheim's peace treaty. Along the way, the Regalia breaks down, and they manage to tail it to a repair station called Hammerhead that is run by a man named Sid and his granddaughter named Cindy. By going through all sorts of means to repair the car, the heroes make their way to the ship bay resort of Golden Key, where they meet a strange man with a long coat who just happens to pass by. By staying the night at the luxurious resort, Ignis brings horrifying news that Insomnia has been destroyed and taken over by the Niflheim Empire, along with the news that Nox's father, King Regis, is pronounced dead. Not wanting to believe what just happened, the four heroes make their way back to the gate leading to Insomnia with their fears proven true about the city's downfall. Upon seeing the city's destruction, Noct and his allies also learn that he and Lunafreya are also declared with being killed. Their next objective leads him and his friends to meet up with the Crownsguard's best soldier, Cor Leonis, to know what to do next. By meeting with Cor, he confirms that Regis Lucius Caelum was killed during the destruction of Insomnia, which leaves Noctis very grief-stricken by this outcome. However, Cor declares to him that now is the time where Noctis must live up to the legacy of the Caelum dynasty by becoming the next king of Lucis right away. Although very reluctant and hardly serious in immediately taking the job, Noctis complies as Cor tells him that he must travel to the many tombs of the fallen kings so that he may be granted all 13 of their most prized weapons to help Noctis take back his kingdom and reclaim the throne. After parting with Cor, Noctis and company continue through the regions of Lead, Duscae, and eventually Clane to seek out most of the weapons within the tombs that are scattered about. In between the partaking of many missions such as slaying demons and destroying Magitech facilities while fighting dangerous figures such as Ravus Nox Fleuret and Naranea Highwind, the heroes meet up with that strange man from Golden Key all the way to Lestalem. He reveals himself as Arden Azunia, as he seeks to restore peace between Lucius and Niflheim as he found their actions to be severely heinous. Nevertheless, he offers Noctis assistance at the Disc of Kothis so that the prince can forge a pact with the Astral Titan since it has been getting restless. Undergoing this task would be a tricky and very arduous assignment due to the Archaean's restlessness, but Noctis succeeds in subduing him while also learning that Titan was encouraged to forge a covenant with him by Lunafreya since she is the oracle who is able to communicate toward the Astrals. Coming to learn about this fact, Noctis is relieved that his betrothed is indeed still alive. Retreating back to the region of Duscae, Noctis is met up by a messenger of the gods and Luna's personal caretaker, Gentiana, as she assists him in forging a covenant with Rama, the Fulgurian. As their journey continues with locating more tombs of the ancient kings, destroying more Magitech facilities, and looking for all possible means to find a way in traveling to Altissia to meet up with Luna, Noctis and his crew begin noticing that the hours of nighttime are gradually starting to become longer than usual, as well as demons appearing more frequently. They also come to learn that the cause of this is due to the Star Scourge, a plague which transforms humans and animals into demons that brings forth darkness. After several trials and tribulations they undertake within the continent of Lucis, Noct, Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto finally make way to Altissia to meet up with Lunafreya and to protect the city from a possible attack from Niflheim as they seek to secure Leviathan on their own, much like what they tried to do with the Archaean. Lunafreya tries to speak to the Hydrian so that it can be encouraged to forge a pact with Noctis and that he may be one step closer to fulfilling his destiny. But Leviathan begins to rampage and destroy most of the city as Niflheim invades to cause another battle to be underway. Noctis rushes to Luna's aid, while the others stay in the city to evacuate the citizens and fight off against the Imperial military. As Luna tries to tame the Astral from any more rage, Arden Azunia appears out of nowhere by stabbing the Oracle to disrupt the Rite even further. But she still empowers Noctis with the power of the past kings of Lucis to fight off against the Hydrian and besting it in combat, successfully forging the pact. Even though Leviathan would be bound under the pact with Noctis, it would come with the price of sacrifice. In a dream he has while being unconscious after the gruesome conflict, a young Noctis is visited by a young Luna spirit as she gives him the ring of the Lucii that was entrusted to her by Regis, as the young prince grieves in sorrow while expressing his discontent that he could not save the other person he deeply cares about, aside from his father. Luna tells him not to grieve, as he is destined to be the chosen king to save all of Eos from the destruction that is bound by the coming Star Scourge. With her final goodbye to the prince as Luna's spirit is brought into the afterlife, Noctis wakes up with the ring in his hand, and he is greeted by Ignis, who is now blind because of what happened during the attack by Niflheim and Altissia. The two of them reunite with Gladio and Prompto as they leave Altissia along with the Regalia to make their way to Grallia, the capital of Niflheim, in hopes of reclaiming the stolen crystal. Even though Noctis is bestowed with the Ring of the Lucii from the late Lunafreya and forged a covenant with 3 of the Astrals so far, accepting his destiny to become the true king would not be that easy, as the loss of his father and Luna would leave him in a huge state of depression, which would create friction between the team, mostly between him and Gladiolus. Being sick at Noctis with moping because of losing Luna and not being more resolute to his purpose, Gladio and the prince get in a very heated argument, with the former chastising him severely for continuing with the slack attitude and not taking his role very seriously, while the latter says that it's not all that easy to immediately cope with. Ignis berates Gladio for his impatience, while Prompto tries to play the mediator with breaking up all the bickering amongst each other. Fortunately, the fighting between the heroes comes to a head, as Noctis and Gladio distance themselves because of their heated argument for some time, but they continue to help each other and assist Ignis with being aware of his surroundings now that he is permanently blind. However, things wouldn't be that easy for the heroes, as Ardyn and Zunia wasn't that too far behind them. While on a train for the Kingdom of Tenebrae, Noctis has a rude meetup with Ardyn, as the prince knows that the weasel of a chancellor killed Luna and knows that he doesn't show any remorse for what he has done. However, Ardyn knows that he can't fool him in any way whatsoever, and begins toying with Noctis by going as far as to having the prince knocking Prompto off the train from its top to separate himself from everyone else. Ardyn retreats off the train as Noctis, Gladio, and Ignis make their way to Tenebrae as they meet up with Aranea Highwind, who has left the Niflheim Empire with her men to assist in a relief effort on the displaced citizens in the Fallen Kingdom. Being assisted by her men with reaching closer to the capital city of Grallia, Noctis and crew come into contact with a demon when the cold snowy weather is starting to grow stronger. Gantiana arrives to help Noctis and inform him the truth about how Luna's life was slowly in decline for contacting the Astrals while she was alive, and bids farewell as she is revealed to be the Glacian, Shiva, and forges her pact with Noctis to defeat the demon and press forward. Nearing toward the dark and dystopian capital, Noctis and crew use the Regalia to undergo the last hurdle to reach the Magitech facility called Zegnatus Keep, while their own vehicle is destroyed in the end. As they reach the facility, Noctis is immediately separated from both Gladio and Ignis with no access to his own weaponry due to the subduing of the powers of the crystal within the keep. Fortunately, the prince still has the Ring of the Lucii in his possession, but even though he is initially reluctant with putting the ring on his finger, he accepts his destiny for knowing that he is the one who can save his friends and retrieve the crystal. By plunging deeper and deeper within Zegnatus Keep, Noctis is constantly taunted, berated, and toyed with by Ardyn from within the facility speakers while the prince is frantically searching for his friends. After many trials while proceeding within the facility, Noctis finally reunites with both Gladio and Ignis as they notice that the prince has begun showing a much more serious and stronger resolve to become the next king of Lucis. They immediately locate Prompto, who is being held prisoner within the facility, and they come to learn that Prompto was a clone who was bound to be turned into another soldier within the army of Magitech soldiers. Prompto was afraid that no one would accept him if they knew about his origins, and why he was alone most of the time throughout the earliest years of his existence. But Noctis still cherishes him for being the only person who did not address him with the code of royalty, while both Gladio and Ignis are grateful to him for being a great friend to them as much as he is to the prince. As the heroes press on, they come face to face with Emperor Eudolus Aldercapt and Ravus Nox Fleuret, who have both turned into demons, thus revealing more of the truth that Ardyn is a calculating villain who used everyone, including the Niflheim Empire, to further fulfill his own agenda. After being separated from his allies at their request, Noctis arrives at the crystal to take it back, but once again meets up with Ardyn, who reveals his true identity as Ardyn Lucius Caelum, the man who was to be the true king of Lucis within Eos's history, but was ousted by the Lucii and the Astrals for absorbing the Star Scourge and being granted with the gift of immortality. Noctis is then pushed within the crystal and brought into the astral realm, as the others are left to flee from Grallia, as the world of Eos is forever bathed with eternal night. Within the astral realm, Noctis is greeted by the leader of the Astrals, who is none other than the Draconian, Bahamut. The Draconian explains that Noctis can banish the darkness from Eos with the power of Providence, but at the sacrifice of his own life. At the same time, the power of the crystal concentrates at a gradual pace, which in turn makes the Ring of the Lucii become more powerful with every Lucian King spirit. After Regis's unfortunate passing, Noctis can wield the full power of the crystal as its strength is even greater than the gods, and finally become the true king. In order to fulfill the prophecy, Noctis' spirit remains dormant within the astral realm for a decade so that he can be physically and mentally prepared for the day when his sacrifice must bear fruit. For the next 10 years, Noctis' training from within the astral realm would help shape him into a wiser, more confident, and more devoted individual to live up to the legacy of the Caelum bloodline. After the long slumber of training himself in spirit, Noctis wakes up within the mortal realm and ends up on an island called Angel Guard, where his father's private boat is stationed nearby. By waking up, he sees that the entirety of Eos is blanketed in darkness since the Star Scourge has poured throughout the entire world and making demons more frequent and more powerful to prey upon the weak. Noctis makes his way out of the island and arrives in Golden Key to make his long trek to reunite with his friends. After traveling for some time and being assisted by those who are putting up a resistance against the demons, Noctis arrives back at Hammerhead, where the once service station that was run by Sid and Cindy has now been built as a resistance fortress for those who have been battling the demons in the prince's absence. It would be a joyous and very momentous occasion for not only Noct, but he would finally reunite with Gladio, Prompto, and Ignis, who are 10 years older and a bit different in appearance. Gladio's side hair has grown back, his hair has grown a little longer with a ponytail attached, and the tattoos on his arm have begun to fade. Prompto has grown some muscle on his body and has a goatee on his chin. Finally, Ignis still remains with mostly the same attire, while his eyeglasses have been replaced by dark visors and has more hair grown around his head. Even though he became blind and had trouble trying to get around, he has now become far more comfortable with handling himself and is easily more aware of his surroundings. Within the 10 years of Eternal Night, all three of Noct's friends have been battling demons to keep themselves alive, as mostly all the towns have been overrun by them, with most of the world's population ending up in Lestalem to the northwest of Lucis, since it has the most light to keep the demons at bay. Several people, such as the former soldier of the Crown's Guard, Corleonis, Gladio's little sister Iris, and the dragoon mercenary Aranea Highwind, have been battling demons along with Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto, as they have become demon hunters themselves. After some final preparations within Hammerhead, Noctis and his friends begin making their trek to the fallen city of Insomnia to take it back. By spending one last night with sticking together around a campfire outside of Insomnia, the four friends gear up in new attire to reflect their appearance and their titles. Noctis wears the uniform his father wore to present himself as the new king, while the others are properly dressed to become Noctis' own Kingsglaive military. It would be a tumultuous and hard battle ahead of them, as they would be facing some of the strongest demons they have ever come across, only for the king and his men to come face to face with the disgraced astral god in front of the stairs leading up to the Lucian throne, the Infernian Ifrit. With the help of the Astrals Bahamut and Shiva, Noctis and his friends finally put an end to the Infernian and have it forge the final pact with the true king of Lucis, as the full covenant of the astral gods would be complete. However, Arden, who remains largely unchanged from his appearance from 10 years prior, greets the heroes and awaits them within the throne room for the final battle between kings. Noctis and the others arrive at the throne, as the disgraced man knocks the Kingsglaive unconscious, as him and the chosen king fly back onto the streets of Insomnia, where their final battle finally commences. Noctis prevails strong with defeating the Weasel, and his friends arrive back to his side, only for them to bid their farewell to their longtime friend, as he ascends back into the Lucian throne, all alone. Taking up the throne in his name, Noctis equips the Ring of the Lucii to communicate with the lost kings of Lucis, and they bring his spirit into the afterlife, where they all work together, along with the spirit of his friends who are alive or have fallen, and finally eradicate the spirit of the disgraced Arden Lucis Caelum from existence, erasing the demons and the Star Scourge from reality. The sacrifice comes off as a success for Noctis to give up his life in saving all of Eos, as the sun rises over the darkened land once more. Final Fantasy games have always had a tradition with retreading some elements while having their own revisions and additions from previous installments, with Final Fantasy XV being no exception, but it received more attention when it came to all of those elements within its creation. In contrast with how almost all of the games ended up being a Japanese role-playing game with turn-based battles while being stranded in dungeons, caves, labyrinths, forests, and other areas along with the world map, Final Fantasy XV breaks away from being another game with turn-based battles, as everything in its exploration and combat is done in real time. In other words, Final Fantasy XV comes off being more of an action RPG that is more in the vein of the Kingdom Hearts franchise when it comes to the overall combat and exploration. Being in control of Noctis, players are given the opportunity to roam around the continent of Lucis on foot or by traveling in the party's car, the Regalia. By traversing through the journey, players can arrive at towns, pit stops, resorts, cities, dungeons, caves, and many other areas to explore, purchase items, eat food, battle enemies, etc. Even though there are some towns and cities in the game to explore, talk to people, buy items, rest for the day, or even eat food from restaurants and fast food joints, the gas station pit stops make up a vast majority of the other towns that are present. When purchasing items, they can range from any of the traditional items that players are familiar with in the Final Fantasy games, such as potions, Phoenix Downs, antidotes, and remedies, to weapons and accessories that are available. Some other items they can purchase are music selections of past Final Fantasy games or exclusive remixed songs of this game from within the Regalia, to purchasing upgrades, car parts, or decals for the vehicle for customization. More on that later. When players stop at a crow's nest burger joint or a restaurant of any sort, they are given a selection of dishes they can choose from, and specific meals can be a personal favorite amongst the protagonists, or ones will carry temporary buffs for the characters such as more strength, stronger defense, a percentage of additional experience points gained from defeating enemies, etc. Talking to people can be beneficial for story progression, to learning about their own opinions on things, or to learn about certain areas within EOS's history. When traveling between different towns, pit stop hotel resorts, or certain locations within Lucis, players can travel on foot to give off more of the exploration feature that they've become very familiar with in past games, to driving in the Regalia, which is a feature of vehicle transportation that was brought back from Final Fantasy VIII into this installment. Traveling on foot can be beneficial, as players can come into contact with items on the field, to fighting monsters that are within their sight. Riding in the Regalia is more beneficial for fast travel, but exploration on the field is only limited to the roads that players drive on. Ignis does most of the driving, but Noctis can drive as well if players choose to do so, only to make the vehicle travel be more manual focused in a player's control, instead of being automatic when Ignis is behind the wheel. If players think that traveling on foot or through the Regalia may feel too boring, they are also given the privilege to ride on chocobos, as riding them in the open world is back in full force. Catching chocobos is not an option, as riding them comes in the form of paying for the feature at a toll booth with gil from 1 to 7 in-game days to be granted that access. Travel with the chocobo can be more generous to players, as they can reach certain locations much faster than on foot, so that they can complete certain objectives in a much quicker manner. Instead of laying out Gisal greens to have a chocobo arrive, players are given a chocobo whistle to summon them whenever they feel like it. While riding a chocobo, they can move just like any other chocobo in a Final Fantasy game, but they can sprint at a player's leisure to jumping in the air to hop over ledges and such. Holding down the jump button will make players stay hovered in the air when going down a steep incline for a short period of time after making their chocobo sprint. As players travel throughout the game, they will witness that Final Fantasy XV has a day and nighttime cycle implemented into it. Traveling during the daytime makes things easier for them to see what is all within their field of vision from monsters, off-world locations, and items they can pick up. But the nighttime is far more dangerous, as stronger demons are summoned onto the field and the vision is far more limited to players. As nightfall arrives, it is usually best for players to sleep so that they won't have to battle any demons that may potentially get the best of them. Sleeping can come under two categories: hotels and campsites. Hotels are usually featured in towns and certain resorts that have them, while others usually have a camper or recreational vehicle as their primary inns for players to choose. The plus side to sleeping within an inn of any sort is that players are granted a multiplication boost to their experience points they earned from defeating monsters, completing certain objectives, and performing various activities at their own leisure. However, campsites don't feature that at all, as they are given no bonuses to a character's experience points they've gained in the battles they fought. The plus side to a campsite when sleeping within those is the ability for Ignis to cook a meal for Noctis and everyone so that they can eat, as long as the players gain the necessary ingredients from stores, enemies they fought, or capturing certain fauna for their own like fish. The meals that the characters eat can grant them temporary boosts in selected stats, much like the ones whenever they eat at restaurants and the Crow's Nest burger joints. Seeing as how Final Fantasy games have been accustomed to using the active time battle system in most regards, Final Fantasy XV using more of a real-time battle system would be an experiment that many were wondering how Square Enix could pull off this change. When fighting in battle or outside of battle, moving around becomes beneficial as it can help players plan out the best strategy when they are about to enter combat to selecting the appropriate commands when in that phase. For the first time, jumping can be executed manually at any time instead of pushing a button for such a movement to be executed, like what was seen in Final Fantasy XIII. However, the jumping is not all that grand or stylish like what Lightning or her allies could do to traverse in that game alone. Instead, jumping is used to jump over ledges, climb up hills, or jump over gaps that hinder their progress, while that feature in battle is used to perform aerial combat in connection to the jumping. While fighting or being outside of combat, Noctis can use his swords to teleport him to various locations, such as an enemy's location to strike at them from a distance to start a fight, or players can reach up to areas such as higher platforms or up walls which they can stick on if they need to plan the best course of action before a fight. Teleportation drains Nox's magic point gauge, as he is the only character in the party to use MP since he is of Lucian blood, unlike his allies. When landing on higher ground or on walls with his teleportation ability, he can instantaneously restore his magic point gauge and gradually replenish hit points, so it acts as both a curse and a benefit to players. While fighting, players can attack enemies using Nox weapons, in which he can wield between 4 different weapons at a time. Activating which weapon the player wants to use can be easily pressed by one of the buttons on the D-pad, so they can be easily switched. Attacking enemies with his weapons can be done by an endless consecutive string of hits, or for various button presses between them to execute combos. The enemies can be easily detected and locked on if the player chooses to do so, or they can swing their blades wildly without there being any proper guidance. When being on the offensive, however, Noctis is prone to take damage if players aren't very careful. In contrast, when in the defense position, players can easily avoid attacks from oncoming enemies, but at the gradual draining of magic points. While being on the defensive position in battle, players can take cover behind objects such as stones, destroyed vehicles, building structures and such to gradually restore hit points and not fight any enemies in the process. When enemies are about to strike Noctis, players can easily counter them to get back on the offensive immediately. By utilizing all of these abilities in battle, players can store up a bar called a link gauge to perform link abilities with the other allies to give off buffs, status effects on enemies, or to do stronger attacks on them altogether. Each link ability can be grinded after using them a specific number of times, so that stronger effects to them may occur in later fights. If players are in danger of Noctis and his allies losing the fight, they can easily select which characters to use items onto themselves if the situation proves to be very dire. The benefit with Noctis when he's staggering due to massive loss of hit points or being struck down after all of his hit points are gone, he can be given the option to use an item to restore his hit points by a small margin, or a full refill to be back at full strength. Finally, players can use a limit break system for Noctis as it comes in the form of the Armiger mechanic. Armigers can happen after 4 of the weapons that belong to the past kings of Lucis are in Nox's possession. This can lead to some powerful and speedy hits from the crystalline weapons that players have on them, or pressing the shoulder buttons at the right time will make them execute the limit break to its full potential. Just like the link gauge, there is a gauge for the Armiger ability when players attack enemies to restore it as well. Even though players control Noctis throughout the entire game, his allies are all controlled through artificial intelligence, as they have their own abilities in which the prince does not possess. Gladio can perform heavy attacks, as his rage in battle is being built up, Ignis can provide assistance if any allies are in trouble, and Prompto can use machinery as a means of offense or distraction on foes. If the battles prove to be very extreme to the player, they may be granted the ability to summon astrals to deliver the coup de grace on their opponents, but it all depends on the type of landscape from which they are located within Lucis, or from a specific part within the story, like the battle between Noctis and his crew against the Infernian Ifrit, being the only time when they can only summon Bahamut. The basics within the gameplay for the real-time action approach to the combat made Final Fantasy XV very noteworthy in its approach when compared to all prior outings that have released before this one. But if there was something else to stand out in the gameplay, then it would be the amount of activities associated between each character that can come into play when undergoing filler. During the journey, players will come to notice that each character has a preferred activity, like how Noctis enjoys fishing from rivers, ponds, lakes, and such. Gladio scavenging for items while trying to get the team to learn how to live off the land, Ignis cooking food for Noctis and the others, and Prompto enjoying the art of photography. With Noctis' activity of fishing, players can make him wield a fishing rod with its own spool of thread and reel with their own stats to determine how catching a fish will be from being too easy or too difficult. The locations between rivers, ponds, lakes, ocean harbors and such can have an impact on the type of fish that will be around in those areas, to what size and how tough each of them will be to catch on their own. Some of the bigger ones will have Noctis and friends staring in awe for putting up such a strong fight, and catching any type of fish will add to the overall inventory when it comes to the ingredients for Ignis to cook food. In Gladio's case, scavenging the land to search for items and discovering several off-world locations for lore is his specialty. Mostly, this comes from players running around through the continent of Lucis on foot, so that they don't just primarily stick onto the roads to discover many of these things while riding on the regalia, as getting out on foot and discovering those things at a closer glance is the type of activity with what Gladio can do. This even allows for players to fight off against enemies that are scattered throughout the continent, with occasional Magitech engines popping up to release Magitech soldiers to fight off against Noctis and his party. Ignis comes off as the master chef of the group, as he works toward concocting recipes for Noctis and his friends to eat meals when at campsites. The more that Ignis cooks for the group at campsites, from the many recipes he can come up with from the gathering of so many different ingredients and the meals eaten at restaurants and certain other resorts, the more his talents at cooking can expand to newer recipes he probably would not learn firsthand.
That's it! What's up, Iggy? I've come up with a new recipe.
Can't wait to try it.
Ever since Prompto was a child, he always had a fond liking of taking pictures of anything that catches his interest, himself, his friends, and whatever off-world locations that he may never get the chance to do otherwise. The bonuses to completing these activities at the player's own leisure has an experience bar of their own, as grinding those levels of activity can reward players with better rewards and incentives toward that particular hobby. However, completing these tasks can come in the form of side questing, as completing them for certain characters throughout the journey in Lucis can benefit players with additional experience points in Gil. Most of these side quests involve taking pictures at otherworldly locations, collecting certain items for non-playable characters, or even hunting notorious monsters, which will make Noctis and his crew become more renowned as demon hunters based on the numerous hit jobs they take, including a super boss fight against the giant turtle, Adamantus. For the most traditional of role-playing games, including the ones that take a drastic approach that is different than what is seen in the overall norm, growth has always been a major priority to achieve any progress throughout an entire game or its story. Final Fantasy XV is no different, as it has a growth system outside of just completing battles and numerous objectives to obtain experience points for grinding levels. While players are on the menu doing their own things, such as changing equipment on characters to viewing items they have in their inventory, they also can come across 3 unique sections within the whole feature. One of these takes the guise of allowing players to switch between different attire on the characters aside from their weapons and accessories. Selecting certain attire can give the characters certain buffs, as others can lower stats instead. The other would be the magic system, as it plays out very similarly to that of Final Fantasy VIII's magic system. However, players do not have an inventory of magic spells like that game, as they have to be created through flasks. By using the craft of Elemency, magic can be equipped like a weapon. Elemency is when players find elemental ingredients of fire, blizzard, and thunder, and they combine them with treasures and items during the crafting process to create magic in the form of grenades. Most of the magic is formed from the elemental attributes, but certain combinations from the items and treasures can enhance them to become more powerful levels of fire, blizzard, and thunder, and possibly even that of non-elemental power such as flare. Even more unique is that certain other items and treasures can make the created magic have special effects, such as healing party members when used, casting status-inducing spells, etc. The only downside is that each creation of magic in the form of a grenade is very limited with its use, as a small quantity are produced every time Elemency is used. Whether within any area of the map can be or not be beneficial to the players when elemental magic is utilized. For instance, if it is raining, it is best to use thunder magic, as they'll be enhanced due to this effect. Conversely, using fire during any clear day can char the landscape and possibly cause demons to flee in fear of it. If players found that to be too cumbersome, ring magic is also an option that becomes available later on. Unfortunately, Noctis is only allowed to use ring magic through the Ring of the Lucii, as the only 2 spells at his disposal are Death and Holy Magic, as the spells are mostly Arcana spells. Using ring magic will also deplete Noctis' MP if it is continuously used. Another feature that players will be making use of during the journey is the ability to ascend their characters with better results from the different activities in the gameplay through the Ascension Grid. As players go through the game at their own leisure, they can gain ability points through various means such as from fighting enemies, completing objectives, or even grinding their levels. The ability points can then be used to enhance features found in 9 different skill trees. Those 9 skill trees are for the categories of Armor, Magic, Recovery, Techniques, Combat, Teamwork, Stats, Exploration, and Wait Mode. The Armor skill tree can grant benefits to players when the limit break is used in combat, such as bonus experience points, gaining extra ability points, temporarily boosting attributes, reducing the depletion of Armor mode, etc. The Magic skill tree can do all sorts of things, such as granting bonus spells, an increased bonus in elemental deposit absorption from the elemental crystals found within the field, increasing the power of spellcrafting, and others that prove to be a benefit than a detriment. The Recovery skill tree can wield benefits to Noctis when taking cover to restore hit points or when sprinting on foot, but his allies can gain a boost in strength, vitality, and hit points restored by a certain percentage when certain criteria is met. The Techniques skill tree allows for newer Link skills to be unlocked, a better replenishing of the tech bar, or even the possibility to go beyond the damage limit on foes, instead of being topped at 9,999 hit points of damage. The Combat skill tree can boost Noctis' ability to a certain extent when battling foes, such as breaking appendages off of demons with better results, increasing damage from certain actions such as blindside attacks in battle, or even reducing the cost of magic points when using it through ring magic and maneuvers when fighting. The Teamwork skill tree can give off stronger bonuses when certain link strikes, counterattacks, and antagonizing damages are committed in combat. The Stat skill tree gives the player the privilege to gain additional accessory slots to equip, instead of what they are already granted with, along with an increase to specific parts of their stats. The Exploration skill tree can grant the characters more ability points, experience points, obtaining more items, or even extending the buffs from the meals eaten from campsites and restaurants when the activities of fishing, survival, cooking, photography, riding on chocobos, and traveling in the regalia take priority. Lastly, the Wait Mode skill tree can grant benefits when players use it during combat, like boosting damage after scanning an enemy for its elemental weakness, stopping the wait timer from depleting, restoring the wait timer after defeating an enemy, or possibly giving off better results when warp strikes are executed on foes. The last thing in the gameplay that most people come to know about is that the regalia can be customized to the player's liking when they are at Hammerhead, and with Cindy tuning it up to the player's needs. They can change the color of their vehicle from the specific colors or through customizable paint jobs, plaster on some decals for more fashion, or even equip certain parts on the car that can benefit the player, such as radial headlights on the regalia when traveling at nighttime to avoid frontal contact with demons, improved gas mileage, or even strengthening the car from taking too much damage from certain obstacles in their way. When riding in the regalia during the early portions of the game, it has a gas meter and will need to fill up on gasoline when it starts getting low. Riding in the regalia to certain destinations the first time around in real time is a requirement, but doing that after the first time can grant players the option of fast traveling to their destination without having to wait in real time if they choose to, only for a small fee of 5 gil per fast travel. All of these elements in the overall gameplay made Final Fantasy XV truly different from what was already established in past installments, as the newest additions with the activities and such made it a breath of fresh air for those who felt that the series was beginning to show its age, without much change taking progress. Several critics were largely in favor of these newer additions, and its change of making a mainline installment of Final Fantasy take a more real-time action-oriented approach to its overall gameplay, as Final Fantasy XV would go on to receive numerous positive reviews and end up being the first game in the series to break even on its development costs after it has sold nearly 9 million copies since its release. Before and after the game came out, and as more time went on, players have become incredulous toward the game's design choices. The most longtime fans were not largely in favor of the game being more along the lines of a real-time action RPG, as the series has been mostly consistent with incorporating the active time battle system, which Final Fantasy XV lacks entirely, and they felt that it should have remained as a spin-off outside of the mainline titles in the series. On the side of those who gave the game a fair shake, while waiting for it to release for quite a long time since it was originally conceived as Final Fantasy Versus XIII, they felt that the overall game did not meet their expectations in its delivery. whether if it comes from its bland, lifeless narrative, cutting out several elements from Versus XIII into this installment that they wanted to see in the finished build, or certain technical performance issues that arose within the game, they felt that Final Fantasy XV was another game that came off feeling left unfinished. The overall problem with Final Fantasy XV was not that it was actually a bad game. In fact, there are several from both camps who come out and claim that they actually enjoy their time with it. They felt that the additions and changes to the overall game made it very enjoyable, since some felt that the active time battle system was already an outdated feature for today's role-playing games. Even the high level of polish to the overall game made it worthy for players to invest their time with completing it from beginning to end. Not to mention that the overall story went back to being a more simplistic tale, instead of being overly complicated like what was seen in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy or from prior installments. Even though they felt that the story was completely bland and without heart, certain elements that made it commonplace within the gameplay, such as the interaction between Noctis and his comrades, was able to elevate itself from being a depressing delivery to their eyes, and the portrayal of Arden Azunia and his actions while being the main antagonist were some of the greatest accomplishments that Square Enix managed to pull off in the overall narrative. Certain cities and regions within the world of EOS would pay an homage to locations from the real world, such as the region of Lied being very similar to the western United States, and the city of Altissia being very similar to that of Venice, Italy, only adding in more to the charm of the realism that Final Fantasy XV was going for. From a technical standpoint, the development team pushed the hardware of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One with what they incorporated from their own engine possibly better than most other games that were available within the market at the time, which is all the more impressive when coming from a team of experienced and inexperienced programmers. They clearly put in a lot of hard work into the game for years and remain proud of it, especially given the amount of time and resources they had. Even though the camps between longtime fans and those who were anticipating the game since 2006 had their own complaints and reasons for despising it, the general consensus ended up being one and the same. The main problem with Final Fantasy XV was that it ended up as a game that players didn't want, and it continues to be perceived that way. While the game admittedly borrows so many elements from the Kingdom Hearts franchise in terms of its free-flowing combat and hack-and-slash action, there was not enough to help the game stand out on its own. There are few who would argue that the final game was anywhere near as compelling than what was originally proposed as Final Fantasy Versus XIII. Taken as a mainline installment of the series, there's not enough here to satisfy those fans wanting more from what they previously enjoyed about the franchise. Final Fantasy XV still became commercially successful since the first day of its release, with many of the attributing sales to that on the PlayStation 4, but perhaps that became less of an indication of its quality and more on the fact that the franchise's library of high-quality sellers within the main numbered installments were becoming fewer and far between. Amongst the praise and accolades that Final Fantasy XV received, one of the most unanimous and definitive accomplishments that most people can attest to was the game's overall soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura. Shimomura has been a well-known musician amongst those within the Japanese video game industry, much like Nobuo Uematsu and Koichi Sugiyama. And her breakout into fame was when she was the person responsible for creating Street Fighter II's original soundtrack at the time. However, she later joined Square Company and became involved with a number of projects for them, with many of them being in collaboration with whatever Tetsuya Nomura worked on, such as the first installment of Parasite Eve and through every installment of Kingdom Hearts up to this very day. After leaving Square in 2002 to become freelance, she still remained in contact with the company and continued to contribute toward a number of projects with them while working with other companies on other games during her time. During her time with working on the game when it was originally called Final Fantasy Versus XIII, Shimomura felt that she did not need to worry about following in the footsteps of other Final Fantasy composers like Nobuo Uematsu, as she would have more creative freedom with the tunes she would create. By the time when the game was announced as being rebranded to Final Fantasy XV, she had already developed a clear concept of how she would press on with her initial path, as the rebranding necessitated newer pieces to be made. A grand total of 96 tracks for Final Fantasy XV would be made, with Yoko Shimomura only contributing 80% of the overall soundtrack, as the other 20% would be variations of her compositions that would be handled by other people. Those people who arranged the tracks for Final Fantasy XV would be John Graham when it came to working on the music for Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV, Kaoru Wada, Mitsuhiro Ota, Naoki Masumoto, Nicholas Alvarez, Sachiko Miyano, Shota Nakama, Tetsuya Shibata, Yoshino Aoki, and Yoshitaka Suzuki. Shota Nakama runs a group called Video Game Orchestra that does rock symphonic concerts and operates within the recording industry, and the group was contracted to work on the game's soundtrack, where Nakama contracted the orchestras and the choir to help out. It would even be the first time where a Final Fantasy game would use a North American orchestra. Yoshitaka Suzuki worked on the game for 1 year on and off, and did have a crunch time to finish up what he composed, which led him having around 25 pieces of his own music already finished while working on Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV at the time. Some themes in Final Fantasy XV were aimed to encompass the themes of friendship and filial bonds, since the game was mostly told from the perspective of Noctis and his friends. Shimomura tried many different methods in her delivery, discussed the directors to share the worldview, looked at images for inspiration, and read and took in the story to be inspired. Suzuki's way with how he composed for the game was to get many gameplay videos imported to his software so that he could compose the music as if he was in the game as a player. So visual representation was his way to gain inspiration on what music pieces he could create. For example, when composing the parts for when Noctis and his comrades would infiltrate the Magitech bases within Lucis, he would use his experiences when creating music from the Metal Gear series as his advantage while working on Final Fantasy XV. An audio programmer at Square Enix named Sho Iwamoto later talked at the 2017 Game Developers Conference with his approach on how the music was incorporated into the game. He designed the composed music to be implemented into an interactive music system, as there was a worry that making the music interactive would distort those said compositions and not make them memorable. However, Iwamoto declared that Final Fantasy music always had a tendency for being epic, memorable, to have a strong melody line, and to be one of the selling points of the series. So his aim was to have seamless transitions without losing quote-unquote epicness within the game's interactive music system. The overall goal was not to avoid repeating the same music, but to enhance the player's emotional experience by playing applicable music that would best suit the situation. This can be heard when certain occurrences happen within the gameplay, such as riding a chocobo, summon an astral when things got rough in battle, or when stepping into a restaurant at certain locations like Hammerhead and Golden Key. Probably the song that made Final Fantasy XV's music the most iconic was its main theme called Somnus, or Latin for the word sleep. While the music was composed by Yoko Shimomura, it had Latin vocals sung by Andrea L. Hopkins, an American singer from Atlanta, Georgia, who contributed to some songs within Final Fantasy XV's arranged album when it was being worked on. Somnus would not be the only vocal song to encompass the game, as Square Enix contracted Florence and the Machine to contribute 3 songs into the soundtrack, with one of them being an instrumental rendition of the 1961 classic tune Stand By Me by the late American singer Benny King. Stand By Me would be the second licensed song that Square Enix would use to contribute toward a main Final Fantasy game soundtrack, after My Hands by Leona Lewis for Final Fantasy XIII. – 2016 would be the year where Final Fantasy XV would finally release to the masses, but the next year would be what Hajime Tabata would describe as giving back to the players. Every now and then, updates would be made to the overall game that included newer weapons, accessories, attire for the characters, or even events related to a special occasion. Some of those collaborations would be with Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, where both games had something exclusive over the other, while another 2 were based on the Assassin's Creed franchise by Ubisoft and Terror Wars from Mistwalker Studios. Square Enix even partnered up with companies outside of the gaming industry to promote their material in the game, such as the Coleman Company for their outdoor recreational products, Nissan Cup Noodles as a meal for when at campsites, and the vehicle manufacturing enterprise Audi to show off a one-of-a-kind replica of the Audi R8 Star of Lucis vehicle that was used in Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV, with the real-life original being sold off in a lottery where the winner was announced in January 2017, after it was auctioned off. There would even be special hunts that would be made available for players to track down specific demons that are mentioned, so that they can award their characters with a plethora of ability points and experience points upon those monsters' defeat. Ever since the game was announced, a season pass was made available to those who wanted more story-based content for Final Fantasy XV, as Hajime Tabata and his team wanted to put in what they could not place within the game's narrative before its actual release. These story-based episodes through downloadable content would be focused on Noctis' companions Gladiolus, Prompto, and Ignis on specific events from what they did, which players took notice of certain story sequences that were left being pretty vague with no explanation in the main game. For instance, there was a point where Gladio separated from the party and ended up with a huge scar on his forehead after reuniting with the prince and his friends in Lestalem. Another instance would be when Prompto was accidentally knocked off the train that was headed to Tenebrae by Noctis, and he was left to fend for himself in the cold, snowy wilderness, while also immediately knowing about his origins of being a clone subjected to an experiment to become another Magitech soldier which he evaded from. The one instance that involved Ignis would be when he became blind after Leviathan's wrath unleashing on Altissia when the Niflheim Empire raided the place and with Lunafreya trying to quell the Astral's animosity. These 3 story-based add-ons through downloadable content would tell those tales to the players, as they would be known as Episode Gladiolus, Episode Prompto, and Episode Ignis. For the case of Episode Gladiolus, Gladio reunites with Corleones and undergoing trials to help him become stronger in his position as being the King's Shield much like his father, and his trials would have him go up against Gilgamesh, the same character who became a part of past games in the Final Fantasy franchise. In Episode Prompto, he tries to find a way in reuniting with Noctis and the others after having been accidentally pushed off the train headed to Tenebrae when Arden sprung a trap. But his part in this journey acts as a means of self-reflection on whether he can face up the truth about himself in front of his best friend, with Aranea Highwind acting as a moral compass. Episode Ignis shows how deep that Noctis' most trusted advisor would go down and sacrifice himself just to see the prince take up the stand of being the King of Light, even if it meant doing things that would permanently hurt Ignis in the process, like stopping Ravus Nox Fleuret and using the Ring of the Lucii for himself to try and stop Arden Azunia that left him permanently blind. It was even the first time where an alternate ending to that scenario would also come into effect that affected the game's tale, like what if Ignis was taken into Gralia in Prompto's place, where he would be the one to fully defeat Arden in his own right. Finally, another story-based scenario in the form of downloadable content would be the online multiplayer mode called Final Fantasy XV, Comrades. What made them completely different from each other were their exclusive gameplay mechanics. In Gladio's case, the experience was more built as pure hack-and-slash action, where brute strength was its key component because of his character. For Prompto, the gameplay element was based on third-person shooter mechanics similar to that of other games with that game design like Gears of War and Arma Army of Two. For the case of Ignis, most of his gameplay revolved around synergist roles and other forms of magic toward his twin daggers that no one has complete command of. In Final Fantasy XV Comrades, instead of playing as an established character in the scenario, its purpose allows players to create their own avatar character who is being trained to become a soldier amongst the Kingsglaive military, who will assist Noctis in fighting off against Arden and the Star Scourge at the end of Final Fantasy XV's story. These avatar characters are assisted by the likes of Corleones, while also receiving help from Libertus Ostium, who returns from Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV. Its tale plays out more of a mission-based storyline that chronicles the 10-year gap in parallel to Noctis going into the Astral Realm, and rising up with fulfilling his destiny in the main story's finale. Completing these scenarios will offer free perks, such as weapons and armor to be available within the main game. The overall reception to the story-based DLC for Noctis' allies came off being mixed to positive in their delivery, as they helped shape Gladiolus, Prompto, and Ignis even further for what they truly are. However, the general consensus still found some of the subplots and characters to still be lacking, and not fully addressed, such as the likes of Corleones, Aranea Highwind, and Iris Amicidia being demon hunters during Noctis' 10-year absence, or even why Arden Azunia has a deep hatred for the Lucii. Hajime Tabata goes on and claims that he wants to make more downloadable content that are based on the other characters that have been left out of development, but nothing has been set in stone at the time when he gone on record to state his response. Fortunately, people who were wanting more story-based downloadable content got their wish, as Hajime Tabata and Square Enix announced that 4 more scenarios were currently in the works that would help more of the story, but they were to be made to act as an alternate delivery on the ending events of Final Fantasy XV, after the alternate ending in Episode Ignis was greatly acclaimed by fans. These 4 story-based DLC packs would be chronicled under a new story called Dawn of the Future, where they acted as an alternate storyline for those who were discontent with how Final Fantasy XV's ending was canonically delivered. The 4 DLC packs would have tales that would be centered on 4 characters: Arden Azunia, Aranea Highwind, Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, and Noctis Lucis Caelum. Since the announcement was made in 2018, it wouldn't be until next year when Episode Arden would be the first to release. In between the DLC's development and release, Square Enix invested money into a new development studio called Luminous Productions that focused on creating games that are mostly of AAA quality like Final Fantasy XV. The Episode Arden DLC would finally release on March 25th, 2019, and its story takes place 30 years before the storyline of Final Fantasy XV. Episode Arden plays out with how Arden Azunia came to possess such great hatred toward the kings of Lucis and his near assassination attempt on King Regis. Flashbacks come into play with Arden previously being a kind soul who would absorb the Star Scourge into his body in order to purify those who were suffering from it, but the Lucii would punish him for doing what they deemed a devilish deed. Gameplay would be an amalgamation of elements seen from the characters of Noctis, Gladiolus, Prompto, and Ignis in some way, shape, or form, and newer elements would also take effect, such as the Inferni and Ifrit being a gameplay element alone. On top of the DLC's release, a special 16-minute prologue in the form of an OVA was made that gave more clarity toward Arden Azunia's past. However, Episode Arden would be the only downloadable content to release amongst this new storyline, as Square Enix announced that the other DLC packs for Dawn of the Future were cancelled due to a massive financial loss after Luminous Productions went live and no more future being seen in Final Fantasy XV as a whole. As unfortunate as the circumstance became, Hajime Tabata would go on and claim that he hopes that the rest of the storyline for Dawn of the Future to get made in some way, whether it be in more original video animations or in a novel. Fortunately enough, a novel was made that covered the entirety of the events from the Dawn of the Future storyline, and it would be written by Jun Eshima, who was given a rough draft that outlines the events in all the stories of the tetralogy. Final Fantasy XV Dawn of the Future depicts some of the characters in a very different light, such as Arden Azunia, who now acts more as a sympathetic anti-hero, and the Astral Bahamut, who has a more antagonistic personality and wants to rid Eos of both the Star Scourge and the bloodline of Lucis for his own nefarious purposes. The novel released in Japan right after the cancellation of the DLC tetralogy, with it releasing in the West in the summer of 2020. As successful as Final Fantasy XV managed to become from the critical and commercial status quo after the mixed results from some of the other projects like Brotherhood Final Fantasy XV and Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV, other projects in relation to the Final Fantasy XV universe were conceived from within and outside of Square Enix. Outside of the downloadable content made available to the main game, most of these other projects were rather small scale in size, as they were tailored for the digital storefronts or through various mobile devices. Some of them would be A King's Tale Final Fantasy XV, as it played in the vein of a side-scrolling action brawler very reminiscent to beat-em-ups in the late 80s and early to mid-90s. Justice Monsters 5 is a version of pinball that became initially available on mobile devices, but as a bonus minigame in Final Fantasy XV, since the mobile version has recently discontinued. King's Knight, Wrath of the Dragon is another mobile game that came out that pertains to the Final Fantasy XV universe, and it became a remake of the NES Famicom game of the same name. However, just like Justice Monsters 5, support for the game has ceased, long since its release, probably because of the less than stellar reception the NES Famicom original received during the 80s. Monster of the Deep Final Fantasy XV is a VR game exclusive to the PlayStation 4, where players can control an avatar character who can interact with Noctis and his friends as they try to fish in various ponds, rivers, and the ocean like what players can do for the Crown Prince in the main game. Final Fantasy XV A New Empire is an MMO strategy simulation game for mobile devices that became more heavy amongst the pay-to-win model. Final Fantasy XV Episode Carbuncle became an exclusive manga that was made for Famitsu, with it being drawn by Kino Takahashi, which covers the adventures of Nox pet Eidolon of the same name. As stated, many of these projects in the Final Fantasy XV media empire were relatively small, that weren't as big as the main game, but there were two projects that had the most attention, which were around the same size as its original counterpart. These would be Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition and Final Fantasy XV Windows Edition. Pocket Edition ended up as a retelling of the original Final Fantasy XV, but it became watered down as most of the story ended up being very linear, with many of the side quest elements getting scrapped or watered down to accommodate its scope. What made it very unique was its new art style for the characters, as they sported more of a chibi-style appearance that makes many think it came from a handheld like the Nintendo 3DS or the PlayStation Vita. Originally a mobile game that released in 2017, it received an HD port for the digital storefronts on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC by the next year. However, Final Fantasy XV Windows Edition was the most ambitious of the projects, as it released on the Windows Store, Steam, and EA Origin service for download. Windows Edition is a faithful port of the original Final Fantasy XV on consoles, but numerous additions were in place, such as using different graphics cards, CPUs, and RAM to help maximize the quality the game was going for, since it became very demanding for the most high-end technology. Plus, people could output the game onto 8K monitors if they had them available. All the DLC that released before the Windows version would be instantaneously available for that version of the game, minus the Episode Arden DLC that came out sometime later. A re-release of Final Fantasy XV on consoles also came about in the form of Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition that featured everything the PC version had, along with what was brought about through the numerous patches, but it also included new features in the main game that was also present in Windows Edition. Each new piece of content that came out in the Final Fantasy XV universe held various reception that ranged from completely unnecessary at worst to underrated at best. Whether if these new pieces were made just for obligatory purposes or to encompass the entire story of Final Fantasy XV in an important manner are still up in the air. Unfortunately, many have agreed that the Final Fantasy XV Universe project has become another victim of Square Enix milking a Final Fantasy game for all it is worth based on a numbered installment success, rather than never wanting to truly leave good enough alone. Sometime before the release of the Episode Arden DLC for Final Fantasy XV, the designers over at Luminous Productions and the heads of Square Enix would experience a very drastic transition in lieu of the Dawn of the Future DLC Tetralogy's cancellation and the massive financial loss after the development studio went public. The director of Final Fantasy XV, Hajime Tabata, announced his departure from both Luminous Productions and Square Enix on October 31st, 2018. It would also be around that time when the rest of the downloadable episodes for Dawn of the Future ended up getting cancelled. While these announcements came off as a cause for concern for fans of Final Fantasy XV, nearly all the team members of the game were not that surprised by the outcome at all, given Hajime Tabata's current circumstances. For working so much on Final Fantasy XV and all of its post-release content, Hajime Tabata ended up getting burnt out by the constant delivery of DLC in relation to the game. In other words, Tabata lost interest in doing anything else that is related to Final Fantasy XV. When looking back at the game's development in post-release DLC, Hajime Tabata never worked on a project that was so gargantuan in size, as most of his projects were much smaller in scope. Games with a scope that small were easy for the likes of Tabata to get his projects done with satisfaction, as they were mostly complete experiences. Being brought into Final Fantasy XV, as that was his first challenge on a large-scale game on a console, was a test for the designer, and working on more content for it when it was under the guise of a games-as-a-service model is enough to make him lose interest when it was originally perceived that what was brought forth before Dawn of the Future got conceived was already enough. His colleagues knew of the pressure he faced, and it was up to them to pick up the pieces where he left off. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, as Hajime Tabata's colleagues also lost interest in Final Fantasy XV, and it led to the cancellation of the other DLC episodes, except Episode Arden. Whether if it was a loss of interest or the struggle of developing a game with a highly advanced engine such as the Luminous Studio engine done for Final Fantasy XV, the chances of there being any more content in Final Fantasy XV are slim to none, to the eyes of gamers and Square Enix as a whole. Thus, Luminous Productions ended up getting restructured due to Tabata leaving both them and Square Enix, and they are currently creating their first original IP for the PlayStation 5 and Microsoft Windows, currently called Project Athia. Tabata has gone on record to express his disappointment that no one would be willing to pick up where he left off in terms of the DLC packs for Dawn of the Future, and he felt very sorry for those who were greatly looking forward to them. Many people became very critical towards Square Enix because of a prolific designer such as Hajime Tabata stepping down, when their culture was speculated to be very harsh, but Tabata has come out and denied these allegations by stating that he left Square Enix on good terms through his own free will, and that Final Fantasy XV nor its DLC were the cause of his departure. Plus, he did not want to hold back the development team who were awaiting his every command, as he felt he'd done all that he could on the project. Shortly after his departure, Hajime Tabata founded his own video game studio called JP Games Incorporated, and his first project post-Square Enix was announced at that point. Whatever it is that he is working on, many who come to appreciate Hajime Tabata and his work ethic are eagerly awaiting his next big gig as a game designer, whether it be a Japanese RPG or something entirely new. Final Fantasy XV, as another game in the franchise, has also endured a precarious existence. A game with a development history as troubling as Final Fantasy Versus XIII still seems much less likely to ever happen again. It was plagued with numerous delays due to several experimentations to possibly facing the risk of cancellation that had made the company's business to restructure, which led to Hajime Tabata and his team working together with those from the first production department to make Tetsuya Nomura's newest idea become a reality. On top of that, Square Enix was also willing to support Nomura's decision to making sure that the game was made, no doubt thanks to their previous years of success together. From what was seen as a promising project to the eyes of those who waited for it within the 10 years of its development, to a product that did not meet the expectations of those who were underwhelmed by its delivery, Final Fantasy XV comes off with mixed feelings, as those thought its prolonged development caused it to suffer the result as it did, while others thought it became worth the wait in the end. Since the development between Final Fantasy Versus XIII to Final Fantasy XV ended up as a long and arduous journey, people have begun viewing Tetsuya Nomura suffering from not wanting to stick with what is all at his disposal when newer opportunities arise during a game's creation. Thus, it led to many of his future projects such as Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake taking such a long time to see them release. It would be the same with Final Fantasy XV when it came to him working on it as director when Final Fantasy Versus XIII was still around, and it led to others believing that Nomura's workload was being stretched out too much for him to work on anything that would need his most attention. It simply becomes a case of biting off more than he can chew, as that has been seen for Square Enix nonetheless. Before and after Final Fantasy XV released, several news bits about the game's tumultuous development and what was conceived during the earliest development structures that had to be cut out or implemented in started to surface from behind-the-scenes material or in other games they appear in, making Final Fantasy XV even more unappealing to its detractors. However, to fully understand the entirety of Final Fantasy XV's delivery is to look back on the project with its own origins. Instead of becoming what could possibly be Tetsuya Nomura's own magnum opus that he would conceive for his own Final Fantasy game to be directed by him, it instead came off as a product that many people wish would never have happened. Not because of bitter feelings towards certain additions, omissions, its struggled history, or even certain design choices, but because many fans who constantly follow Tetsuya Nomura's work just simply don't want this to be the finished game to remember him by. For being the most recently released game in the Final Fantasy series, marking the end of the 15th installment's creation, when most of the prior entries were about innovation in its story, characters, themes, music, technical aspects, and overall gameplay, left many to believe that Square Enix made Final Fantasy XV go out with a whimper, instead of a bang. Even with Hajime Tabata's departure and the episode Arden DLC being the only thing to release, with the Dawn of the Future novel being the final delivery from Final Fantasy XV to the masses, many have agreed that those quittances bring a quiet fitting end to what was considered a long and convulsive journey to the multimedia project toward the overall game. As time goes by, those final words of King Regis during the post-credits scene of Final Fantasy XV and the scene itself reflecting the Final Fantasy XV universe can both be considered all the more appropriate, while ever more bittersweet.
Dearest Luna, you did well to deliver the ring to Noctis. Wayward though my son may indeed be, he has made me proud. May you too know happiness.
After Square Enix became whole and Hironobu Sakaguchi left the company to form Mistwalker Studios, there has been an ongoing conversation amongst fans about how they still wish for the days when Sakaguchi was still attached to the Final Fantasy property for Square, and how he and the company were releasing one beloved installment of the series after another. Perhaps due to the lack of information available and choosing to simply follow insider headlines over the years, many failed to recognize the changes happening for both Square and Hironobu Sakaguchi meant that their exclusive working relationship was never going to last, or even be the same as it was ever again. When they first started working together, it was during a time when Square was a very young and up-and-coming video game company where they kept releasing one commercial failure after another before Final Fantasy was conceived and made into a phenomenal success that saved them from inevitable decline. During that time, they were creating new IPs while also learning to adapt to the standards of video game development on newer generations of hardware that would force them to notice how much bigger in scope that each newer game they made would become than the last. By the time when Square merged with Enix to become Square Enix, they would experience even bigger thresholds in game development, and the resources needed to adapt to the newer generations of hardware ended up as a result of larger technological advancements. Development teams back then usually were small groups that would consist of about 10 to 15 people, but when it now comes to more ambitious platforms like the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC being placed as the current focus, the number of members in a development staff vastly increases to about 1 to 200. Over the past decade, Square has grown to recruit over hundreds of people to their company, and while most of their games by average manage to sell over millions of copies each, the cost of creating newer games with higher production value also rose significantly. So if many of their newer games would not succeed in reaching the sales that the JRPG company would hope for, they would naturally seek to merge with another big group in order to offset the risk. Hironobu Sakaguchi was known for giving every team at Square a lot of creative freedom when it came to developing their own titles or ones that he would conceive, and he would only choose to increase morale, improve on their overall quality, and help out if the teams and their development cycles were not progressing along. Whether or not those games would succeed in selling over millions of copies, the team strived to create memorable experiences with everlasting appeal, making them become nothing like what other video game companies were attempting. It's highly likely that when Hironobu Sakaguchi became Square's vice president and an executive producer, he wanted to honorably preserve the company's overall culture, so that its staff can continue to operate like they still went by the same mindset with what made them and their own creations so memorable from all those years ago. But when Sakaguchi and many other veteran members of the company resigned, and were replaced by other executives throughout time, the opinions about Square as a whole began to change between them. For example, an older executive like Shinji Hashimoto has been credited for still being very supportive of the designers who originally came from Square, whereas a younger executive like Naoki Yoshida has expressed disappointment, saying their skills have become outdated and no longer applicable in today's industry. Just as there have been differing opinions that came from the higher-ups within Square and later with Square Enix, so too did the members of the development teams that came under them. Most of them saw the merger would result in a clash between two companies whose different cultures would make it hard to fully adapt, while most others saw the change coming off as positive, as it could help strengthen team morale. Square Enix can be justifiably criticized for not giving the same treatment, quality, and promotion of their large catalog of IPs when it comes to their more popular franchises, but when games like Chrono Trigger, Bravely Default, The World Ends With You, or even the more recent I Am Setsuna and Lost Sphere were going up against the likes of a new installment of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, or even Kingdom Hearts, it is highly argued that Square Enix only wanted to pool more of their money and resources on the safer bets. Games like Final Fantasy were guaranteed to succeed on the name alone, regardless of how well the series is marketed, so averting that budget onto their other games could have surely helped those games sell more. However, the big question after that would be how much of an actual difference would that make? When Square Enix saw what their other teams were producing when compared to the others, was it really that hard to guess which series would grow from there or even garner a bigger audience? When news of the games that Square and Enix might have worked on but didn't, there was always the hope that whatever else could have been done would end up being much better than what they eventually got, and it's Square Enix's fault that they didn't. Unfortunately, they tend to forget that the games we did get were still from many of the same designers who worked on their favorite games in the past. They did not all go away, but rather they just changed the types of games that they wanted to make. Those same designers were still coming up with so many different concepts, but whether or not they could be pulled off well is only left to speculation at this point. Just as there have been designers who look back at their games with disappointment or regret, so too did the teams who remain proud and happy with what they managed to pull off, regardless of a game's reception or success.
30年作ってきて、なんていうの、オープンワールドになったり最近はその RPG もだいぶ変化してきて、ただ思うのはそのファミコンから僕は始まったんですけども、プレイステーションで 3DCG になって、でその後どんどんハードがやっぱり進化して、ものすごく綺麗な絵が出るように になって、でそのまんま、進化していくのかなと思ったら、最近は今度はそのスマホのアプリみたいなものが、例えば、最初に言ったその、映像がどんどんこう特化していくものが大きな木だとしたら、なんか突然横に太い枝がボコッと生えたようなスマホのアプリみたいなのが出てきて、よくFF 今作ってる北瀬とかともこの前飲んで話したんですけど、なんか全然僕たちが予想してた未来と最近違うよねっていうような話をしていて、ちょっと面白いなと思ってます。
Yeah, so the genre has, as you all know, and I have felt that it's really evolved. We have open world RPGs, different sort of semi sort of genres within the big genre of the RPG. I started off with the Nintendo's Famicom, NES, and then moving on to obviously PlayStation. Everything has evolved, right? Technology has advanced the hardware that we know today. And with that, the visual quality, everything it's more powerful, it's more beautiful. And we kind of see that as the thick tree, the big foundation with a tree trunk that's thick enough to hold the future. And so we kind of know where that's going in terms of expectations. But now you have this category called mobile tablet or smartphones. And they're kind of like this unexpected branch that kind of like popped out of nowhere. But it's quite thick. It's not a flimsy branch. It's really thick. And even that in and of itself is growing into something that we don't know where the future is going to take us. Just the other day, I was having drinks with Kitase-san, who's currently still at Square Enix, and he said, you know what, this is a future that we never knew was coming. We didn't expect this. And so it's good in a way that we have something to look forward to and not just the big expected route of growth in the genre.
While Square's biggest successes came from the games and franchises they made after Final Fantasy's reinvigoration and revitalization of the company's future, it was thanks to many of its top talent and higher executives who worked within Square at the time. Just as there have been many different higher-ups and executives at Square Enix over the years, so too were there at Square Company. While the Japanese RPG company went on to experience unprecedented success, they would also go on and ingest some of their darkest years, with repercussions that continue to steer Square Enix's direction to this day. Back when Hironobu Sakaguchi was Square's executive vice president of the company, he led much of its success due to his rap sheet that was within and outside of the Final Fantasy name. When asked about this in a 2001 interview, whether Square would become too dependent on the Final Fantasy IP, Sakaguchi admitted that it was something Square still wanted to avoid for quite some time. In a way, he never fully envisioned them working on more from the same franchise over and over again for the Japanese RPG developer, but instead he saw the company as a consistent supplier of various and original IPs, so that there could be many options in which consumers could go to if they wanted to experience something original or different. Sakaguchi understood that players who grew up and stuck with the Final Fantasy IP would eventually grow tired and end up wanting to try something new. In that sense, Sakaguchi and everyone at Square had to supply their consumers with all sorts of IPs as a way for them to keep finding a viable form of entertainment on the company's targeted platform. Many of Sakaguchi's teammates and peers also fully understood that doing this and collaborating with outside studios to conceive original IPs were necessary to create the games that Square wouldn't be able to produce effectively themselves. After Square and Enix's merger and Sakaguchi's departure, the new management at Square Enix did not only refuse to create many newer IPs under their name, but they also reduced the output and capital on most of their library of franchises, killing off relations from employees and studios for multiple generations by then. By that point, it became a growing stigma where many of Square Enix's IPs would not receive the same level of support and budget as their more popular franchises would. The presumption that their games either had to undergo a free-to-play model or influx many re-releases on digital platforms, have their own games be developed in-house or from those who maintained close relations with Square Enix, or they would have to make new games from their more popular brands to ensure more unprecedented success and maintain sustainability within their business, have persisted within the Japanese video game company for a very long time. These repercussions have had a significant impact during the 2000s, when Japanese video game companies were on the verge of bankruptcy. The need to merge with others and be stuck with developing new games within their safest moneymakers from their own in-house teams to ensure that sustainability only continues to stop Square Enix and companies like them from taking any more risks when creating more original IPs, since they would most likely not see them make any groundbreaking success as their past games. And the only time when Square Enix chose to collaborate with outside studios is when they would push their partners to make new games games in the form of mainline installments and spin-offs based on their already existing properties. While there have been some general exceptions to that rule, the output on original IPs is far more limited when compared to the scope that Sakaguchi originally had in mind for them. So how can anyone be so sure that this new management at Square Enix would support Sakaguchi similar to that of the old regime? Not just in regards that he would go on and release his own games that did not have Square Enix's stamp on it, or even the ones that came before his departure became imminent. Would Square Enix give Hironobu Sakaguchi the benefit of the doubt after the more recent Final Fantasy games ever since Final Fantasy XII suffered a long and tumultuous development cycle? Would they promote another survival horror RPG franchise like Parasite Eve, or even a new Chrono Trigger that featured a level of satisfaction and everlasting appeal which would only doom itself to garnering a cult following's worth of sales from overseas? Who's to say that Square Enix would support Sakaguchi with his own games that he would go on and create for his company, Mistwalker Studios? The same goes for the only one that was being worked on that inevitably got cancelled. What incentive would they have when all the games on consoles and handhelds that Sakaguchi worked on and released for Mistwalker would result in his company suffering the most underwhelming software sales? The truth of the matter is that there are so many different factors that come into play here that no one can really say which decision was right during that moment in time, since the most logical and true outcome can never be fully understood, because it didn't happen. The one thing that we can know for sure is this. Since the beginning, Square started off as a game development division for a powerline construction company before branching off and becoming an independent studio that grew into a corporate empire. Under Hironobu Sakaguchi and his colleagues, they conceived and designed games as though they were part of one large family. Their day-to-day interactions with each other may not have always been desirable, but for a group of young people with something to prove and to make their mark in the video game industry when looking for that opportunity was more than good enough. To work with the same people to create those games that many gamers grew up with was like a dream that came true in the making, no matter the circumstances. However, at the end of the day, that close and tight-knit camaraderie was never going to last. If those people were going to grow under Square and later for Square Enix, or the other companies they would go to work for or create under their name, that kind of intimacy was bound to be lost in time. As players grow up and discover new experiences within video games, there are times when they would yearn for something less intricate and return to the days where games were considered to be much simpler. Companies like Nintendo, Gung Ho Online Entertainment, and DNA have cultivated that idea of simplicity into a thriving business for many generations, and fans of Square Enix would surely want them to have that kind of success too. Even if Hironobu Sakaguchi had decided to stay with Square Enix after the merger and weather through the coming hardships together, that still would not have stopped him from changing with the times, or to leave the company when he felt that the time was right. Companies are not always defined by brick and mortar, but rather the designers who inhabit them, for better and for worse. But just like all things in life, it's never that simple. People move on, things change, and that's just the way it is. Nothing lasts forever. It's something that we all have to come to accept eventually, but sometimes knowing that makes it no less difficult to immediately come to terms with. Next time in RRPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, Square Enix would pay tribute to the Final Fantasy franchise in so many ways, as they would create games that would be in the form of crossovers, or they would pay tribute to their flagship franchise at their anniversary benchmarks with new experiences within or even outside of the franchise's RPG roots.